Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here today. So I'm going to talk about inequality and the social safety net. And this is basically a condensed version of my combination of my undergraduate class and my graduate class that I'll teach next year. And I just want to start with some motivation for why it's interesting to study inequality and the social safety net. So the political debate around social safety net programs, as you know, is often characterized by extremes. So there's one side of the political debate that says that these programs badly distort incentives and discourage achievement. Another side of the political debate that says that there are no perverse incentives. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And theory is useful for guiding us in understanding, right, what potential effects there are, what potential perverse incentives could occur, what potential consumption smoothing benefits there could be. But ultimately, this is an empirical question. Okay, and so this lecture is going to be, we're going to cover some theory, but I'm going to spend most of the time on empirical questions, empirical challenges, and empirical results. And so I want to touch on three key economic questions about the social safety net. They all just happen to correspond to areas that I work in. So that's, read that whatever way you want. So I had the privilege of being here 2 years ago and presented some work that I have on this first question. Today I'll present some work that I have on the first two questions. And maybe in a couple of years I'm trying to start some work on the third question as well. But the first question is, what is the optimal generosity of the safety net? So for those of you who have taken public finance, this is basically the Bailey-Chetty formula. And how do we implement Bailey-Chetty empirically? How do we estimate that empirically? In particular, we want to think about how do social safety net programs affect labor supply, and how do they affect other outcomes, consumption, health, and well-being? So there's a lot of evidence on the effects of these programs on labor supply, and very little evidence of the effects of these programs on other outcomes like consumption, health, and well-being. And I think that is largely a result of the data that we have available. So with unemployment insurance, for example, we spent a long time in the 70s and 80s quantifying the labor supply effects of unemployment insurance, particularly the moral hazard part. In 1996, John Gruber wrote his paper on the effect of unemployment insurance on consumption, particularly food consumption. And that was kind of a wake-up call of, well, we've been spending a lot of time and a lot of resources estimating one side of the Bailey-Chetty equation, and we also need to think about what are the benefits of these programs. And I think that disability insurance right now is in the same place that unemployment insurance literature was 20 years ago, where we've done a lot of work on the labor supply side or the moral hazard side of disability insurance, and we have very little work on effects on consumption, health, and well-being. And that's generally true for social safety net programs. So in terms of, finding areas for research, I would say, right, your contribution has to be something specific if you want to study labor supply. There are definitely labor supply questions that have yet to be answered, but I think there is a lot of scope for doing work on these other outcomes on consumption, health, and well-being. Again, those are the harder areas, right? The sort of labor supply is the low-hanging fruit because of the data that we have available. It's much harder to get data on those other outcomes. How do we target programs to make sure they reach those and only those whom we want to help? So I'll spend some time talking about tagging, but we'll spend most of the time talking about screening, particularly how we can design programs to have people self-select the people that we want on the program, self-select into the program, and then talk to you specifically about a paper that I have with Yue Li looking at the effect of Social Security field office closings on the targeting of disability programs. Okay. And then the third question on spillover effects. So I think this is another area that is really ripe for research, is, what are the spillover effects of social safety net programs on family members, communities, and society as a whole? And this is an area where, in part because of data limitations, also empirically, this is a challenging question to answer, but we don't have a lot of evidence on what are effects of these programs on people besides the recipients, right? On their family members, on their neighbors, on local labor markets. And so being able to find both the data that would allow you to do that and empirical strategies that would allow you to do that is challenging, but that's something that we will talk about. Okay. All right, and I would love for this to be a discussion and very much welcome your questions, your comments. Anything before we, yeah.
May I just ask, so social safety net, what can I understand under social safety net? Is like disability insurance, unemployment insurance, to something else? And how can we distinguish social safety net or optimality of the social safety net from optimal income taxation in this sense?
Yeah, good question. So social safety net I'm using here as a general term to include both social insurance and means-tested redistribution. So I'll talk about that in a second, just an overview. When we think about, I'll talk about optimal insurance and what that means, and we can think of means-tested redistribution similarly, but I think the conceptual sort of idea of risk across different states of the world versus risk across individuals, right, is something that we have to think about when we compare redistribution programs versus insurance programs. But hopefully that'll become clearer in a few slides. Okay, so I first just want to provide an introduction to the social safety net. What is the social safety net? And why do we like insurance? And then get to those three questions in turn. Okay, so I like to start with this slide, with this graph from the Census Bureau, because this is giving us the official versus supplemental poverty measure. And there are a few differences between the official and supplemental poverty measure, but a big difference is that the supplemental poverty measure considers government transfers, and the official poverty measure does not. Okay. And so what we see is that overall, when we use a supplemental poverty measure, there isn't a big change in the poverty rate, but there is a big change for specific groups. And in particular, you can see that in the United States, when we consider government transfers, the poverty rate for children falls a lot, substantially. And that's because in the United States, public assistance is mostly targeted at households that have children, right? So the poverty rate among children will fall once we consider government transfers. Trivia question, who knows why the elderly poverty rate is going up so much under the supplemental poverty measure? Anybody have thoughts? It's something besides government transfers. So the supplemental poverty measure also considers medical out-of-pocket expenses. So the supplemental poverty measure, in addition to considering government transfers as more income that you have for consumption, will also deduct medical out-of-pocket expenditures as income that you can't use for consumption other than your medical expenses. Okay, and that's why we see this big increase in the poverty rate when we use the supplemental poverty measure. And so this graph is showing you, for the US, different programs that lead to changes in the poverty rate. And it's important, obviously, it's important to say that these comparisons don't take into account behavioral changes, right? So they're just mechanically taking people's income and then adding on the part that is coming from government transfers. Right? So it's possible that official versus supplemental poverty measure overstates the difference, because if people weren't getting government transfers, they might have higher earnings, for example, if income and substitution effects are positive. So this is just mechanically when we consider government transfers versus when we don't, how does the poverty rate change? So you can see that the Social Security program accounts for is the largest program in terms of reducing poverty rate under the supplemental poverty measure. So obviously we have the elderly, the green component, that's the retirement program. But then we have a substantial number of people, middle-aged people and young people, that's going to be dependent benefits and disability benefits. Okay. And then we see that refundable tax credits, so for example, the EITC, is having a big effect on child poverty. And then food stamps, SSI, housing subsidies. And then we talked about medical out-of-pocket expenses. That is the main component that is increasing measured poverty among all three groups when we consider medical out-of-pocket expenses. Okay, so the social safety net, we were just talking about this, takes two main forms. The first is social insurance. So this is insurance against shocks to individuals. So health insurance, unemployment insurance, disability insurance. The idea here is that we are risk averse, right? If we're risk averse, that means that instead of in the good state when I have a job, consuming a lot, and then in the bad state when I lose my job, consuming very little, I'd rather pay into the system when I have a job, consume a little less, and then get benefits from the system when I'm unemployed and consume a little more and stabilize my consumption over states of the world. Okay. And so this is true insurance in the sense that we pay into the program when we are in the good state and then get benefits from the program when we're in the bad state. Okay. We can also, another type of social safety net program is redistribution or public assistance. So this is cash welfare, food stamps, EITC, public housing. And there are different rationales for it. One is just that we have preferences for redistribution and equity. Another argument that you hear is that we can think of it as insurance behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, that if we didn't know where in society we were going to end up, we would want to design a safety net such that there's some minimum floor below which we can't fall. Okay, so I think this is something that all of you know, but it's worth repeating what economics can do for us and what it can't, right? So we can use economics to quantify the trade-off. How much smaller does the pie get when we transfer another slice? So we can try to minimize the trade-off between efficiency and equity. So a good example is the minimum wage versus the EITC, and the EITC is a better targeted program because it considers household income. The minimum wage, because it's going to individual workers, is going to end up paying people whose household income is substantially higher than full-time, full-year minimum wage levels, right? And so there are other reasons why we might choose the EITC versus the minimum wage, but we can at least help to quantify what is the policy that's going to transfer income in the most efficient way. Now, obviously, it can't help us decide whether we should undertake even that most efficient redistribution policy. That's where we have to think about preferences and philosophy and ethics.
Just to make sure, EITC is just tax, right? So like based on the income, you get tax difference. Is that?
So the earned income tax credit is you get a tax subsidy based on, you get a wage subsidy based on how much you work. So if you earn $16,000, you'll get $4,000 a year, depending on the number of kids you have and so on. You'll get some amount, but you only get it if you work. So EITC is an interesting policy because it is exactly the opposite of what we think of as insurance, right? So a traditional welfare program that taxes your benefits as you start working provides insurance because it gives you the most when you're not working and the least when you're working. The EITC does exactly the opposite. It's gonna exacerbate fluctuations in income because it's gonna give you money when you work and it's not gonna give you any money when you don't work. So the argument for the EITC is that it's pro-participation, and we have empirical evidence that it's pro-participation. But to the extent that our social safety net we value the insurance properties of a social safety net, the EITC has the opposite insurance properties of a traditional welfare program. Although I should say it depends on where in the EITC schedule you are. But if you are in the sort of in the phase-in range of the EITC, it's going to have the opposite insurance properties.
With respect to the last part, so you say we can find the most efficient policy, but we cannot say whether this is better than equity or fairness, or can we just have multiple welfare analysis with different focuses and then see?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can all have our own Pareto weights, right, on whom we value most in society, and then we can decide which of these policies to undertake. But ultimately, what your Pareto weights are up to you, right? That is a personal preference. So that's all. Is that what you were asking, or?
The government could give us a set of rules, and then we could answer the question.
The government could give us
the government gives the welfare function, and then we advise.
Oh yeah. So if we've already specified a social welfare function, then yes, then economics can solve everything. But if we have to be able to specify that social welfare function. That's another.
I have a question that's tangentially related. I was wondering about, I don't know, from the generosity level of those policies that you shown on the previous slide. So when we compare those social safety nets to, let's say, social safety nets in a country like Sweden, are they lower? Are they very, very low compared to Sweden? And like, I guess my question is, so if I lose my job and I get employment benefits, are those benefits enough for me to just survive? I'm thinking about the socialist countries, they have a lot of benefits, but unemployment benefits, for instance, they're not enough to even cover the utility bills. So I was wondering just about those problems with insurance, because it seems like the effective poverty rate is very minimal, and I was wondering whether it's because it creates reverse incentives, or whether it's just not enough, it's not generous enough to reduce poverty.
I see. So you're saying that the reason that we don't see is the reason we don't see these programs decreasing the poverty rate more that they discourage achievement, or just that it's not enough money?
Yeah, that's my question. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a good question because it gets to the trade-off that we'll talk about in a few minutes, between consumption smoothing and moral hazard, right? So we can make a program more generous and increase consumption smoothing benefits, but the trade-off is generally that we're going to introduce more moral hazard. We're going to discourage achievement more, or disincentivize work, right? So we often talk about the iron triangle, where you can, if you can make your program more generous, you can also lower marginal tax rates to encourage work, but both of those things are going to make the program more expensive, right? So you're never going to be able to get out of this triangle of if you want to encourage work more, you can lower marginal tax rates, but that means you're going to end up paying people that are higher in the income distribution, and your program is going to be more expensive.
But the current benefits, are they enough to sustain a certain adequate?
Oh, you mean in the United States? Are they?
Yeah, the ones that we use.
So, are they enough? That is a good question. So, I mean, in the example that you were citing in Sweden, right, the unemployment benefits, that's an interesting question. So the unemployment benefits you were saying are not very generous. I don't know very much about Sweden.
No, it's the opposite. They have a very...
Oh, I thought you were saying that they're sort of like other generous programs.
Scandinavian countries are famous for their very generous welfare state.
Yes.
They are a supreme example. And I was wondering, in comparison to them, if all these spendings, are they lower?
They're
or
substantially lower. Yes, substantially lower.
Mhm.
And our tax rates in the United States are also substantially lower as a result. Yeah.
I was intrigued by your recasting of redistribution efforts as potentially seen as insurance under the veil of ignorance. And I wonder if you think that the political discourse in the US, as you maybe alluded to at the beginning, an understanding of something as insurance versus redistribution has changed where our emphasis is in the US, like looking at your cable expenditures. I mean, because for an economist, some of these things might look similar. You also talked about cases where like EATC looks quite different from insurance, but
Right.
is the labeling maybe relevant here, given that we have to sell the policy?
Yeah, so this is an argument that you often hear about social insurance programs. So Social Security, there's a lot of debate about means testing Social Security, right? And the argument against that is, well, if you means test Social Security, it becomes one of our redistribution programs, and then you no longer have the same political support that you had for it. The Medicaid debate right now, right? There's a debate over, well, there's the part of Medicaid that serves people who are sort of low permanent income, right? Low income people. And then there's the long-term care part of Medicaid that serves middle class and upper class individuals who, because they need long-term care, they run out of assets eventually. And so in principle, we could separate those two programs, right? We could have the redistribution Medicaid, and then we could have the Medicaid that looks more like insurance. I think politically there are reasons that people who support low-income Medicaid want to keep them together, right? If we separate these two things, it becomes very easy then to cut the part of Medicaid that only low-income people use and that the middle class doesn't use. So yeah, I think that's important. Okay, so I'm sure many of you have seen this graph before. This is showing you how federal government spending in the United States has changed in the last 50 years. And you can see that in 1953, the social safety net part of the federal government was less than 10%. So income security, Social Security, health. The vast majority was defense spending. In 2007, the social safety net part of the federal budget was more than half. Okay. And so this Paul Krugman quote, the post-Cold War federal government is a big pension fund that also happens to have an army, right? We're spending more and more, especially as the population is aging, on Social Security and health care in particular. And we want to understand the effects of these programs. Okay. On my laptop, these bars were all the same color. But this is just giving you a sense of our social insurance programs, the relative magnitude. So you can see that the biggest by far are the retirement program and Medicare program. Disability insurance, which we'll talk about a little bit today, is a smaller program, but one that's been increasing quickly, and the unemployment insurance program. This is a graph from the CBO on redistribution programs, and the headline here is that Medicaid is by far the largest redistribution program that we have. So we just talked about Medicaid serving low-income people, children, pregnant women, and now with the expansions, also low-income adults without kids. And then we have some of the cash assistance programs, EATC, SSI. We'll talk about SSI today. And then SNAP, so food stamps and EITC and SSI are all about the same amount.
I just can't remember exactly when the Medicaid expansion went into effect. Does this include the Medicaid expansion or no?
So this is 2012, so
it was really close to around that. I just can't remember.
I think it does. It'll include
that's
the
what I
expansions
thought.
of some states. Yeah,
Yeah.
some states expanded after 2012. Okay, so I just want to review quickly. I'm sure many of you know this by heart, but I just want to review quickly why we like insurance and some rationales for the social part of social insurance before we get into those particular questions. So the canonical example here is that we're thinking about choosing between some certain outcome or some lottery, right? And they might have the same expected loss, so you could lose $5,000 for sure, or you could lose $0 with 50% probability and $10,000 with 50% probability. They have the same expected loss, but the risk-averse person prefers losing $5,000 for sure rather than choosing the lottery. Okay, that's the definition of risk aversion. And that's exactly what insurance is going to allow us to do. So when we don't have insurance, we live in a world of option 2, where everything is a lottery, right? Whether we lose our job, whether we get into a car accident, whether we become disabled, everything is a lottery, and then we just, play the game. And if we get the bad outcome with 50% probability, we face these large consumption losses. So to mitigate risk, we're going to purchase insurance and transfer to, or rather evolve to a society with option 1, where we're all going to pay into the system, we're going to pool our risk, and then through the law of large numbers, some of us are going to experience the adverse shock, and we're going to be able to get payment from the system when we experience the adverse shock. Okay. So society is paying the same amount under either option, but everybody who is risk averse is happier under option 1 than they were under option 2. Okay. And so pooling risk, we make everybody better off at no additional cost. And this is the benefit. This is the free lunch of social insurance. So in pictures, I think it's nice to just show how diminishing marginal utility relates to risk aversion, right? So if we have our standard concave utility function with a decreasing marginal utility of consumption, and we think about the lottery that we just talked about, so we think about the $0 versus $10,000, we can put a point on this graph that is the utility of the expectation. We can also put a point on this graph that is the expectation of the uncertain utilities, right? And the expected utility of that is the expected utility of option 2, right? Versus option 1, which is up here. So the intuition that we have for why we prefer option 1 to option 2 is shown in this graph. And it's basically that because of diminishing marginal utility, the gain that we get from going from 5,000 to 10,000 is much smaller than the loss that we incur if we go from 5,000 to $0. Okay. So basically, because of marginal utility, because of diminishing marginal utility, additional gains are much less valued than losses. Okay. So some rationales for why social insurance, for why the social in social insurance, you might think that, well, this is insurance. Insurance is sometimes privately provided, right? And this is an ongoing debate of what is the appropriate role for government. So private market failures, the commonly cited examples are adverse selection, that if we can't mandate that everybody buy insurance, then only people who face the highest risk are going to buy into insurance. That's going to increase premiums, and in the limit can lead to a death spiral. Aggregate or correlated shocks. So the financial crisis is a great example of this, where a lot of private insurers went out of business because they were insuring houses whose prices were correlated. So the prices of all of those houses go down, and then the insurer goes out of business, right? Whereas the government has the ability to borrow from future generations to be able to deal with a huge shock to employment right now, right? So Nate Hendren, whom you'll hear from, has done some work thinking about private provision of unemployment insurance. The big challenge to private provision of unemployment insurance is when we have correlated shocks in the economy, when a bunch of people become unemployed, right? The government can borrow from future generations to smooth consumption over generations. It'd be much harder for a private insurer to do that. The Good Samaritan dilemma. So we have an obligation to help those in need. we cannot commit to not helping people who don't buy insurance, right? And so this is one argument. In addition to adverse selection, this is another argument for the individual mandate in health insurance, that we can't commit to not helping people who haven't bought insurance, and so we're going to require everybody to buy insurance up front. Paternalism, failures of rationality. So I think this is probably one of the biggest reasons, right, that the government is involved in social insurance, but sort of one that we don't talk about a lot. That just we think that people are really bad about making decisions about risk. We don't trust them to do it, and so we're going to tell them that they need to buy insurance. Redistribution, we talked about. This is we could think of it as insurance behind the veil of ignorance. Since we don't observe ability, we're going to use observable characteristics to redistribute, and we'll talk about that a lot more in our targeting section. And then political economy arguments, which we've heard a lot about after the 2016 election, right? That redistribution of gains from growth might help maintain support for pro-growth policies. So to the extent that we want to have free trade and other policies that increase growth, we also want to try to redistribute those gains through these programs. Okay, so I think, yeah.
I'm curious if there's a distinction between saying people are bad at making decisions about their risk, or like people just don't have the bandwidth or time or energy to actually think through all of these scenarios and purchase insurance to cover them. I can see how that would sort of fall under paternalism, but I'm not sure if it's the same.
Sure, that's fair. That's fair, right? Whether people have all of the information and the bandwidth and are still making bad decisions versus they don't have information, or we provide information, but for various reasons they're either bad at calculating risk or they don't take into account the information when they're calculating risk. So I'm trying to think about. I think empirically those two things look the same. I think our policy prescriptions would be different, right? If we knew one versus the other to be true. If we thought that this was just an information problem, then that seems like something that we can address through information campaigns. This is so with health insurance, for example, right? The government has tried to make hip commercials to make health insurance attractive to young people, but then there's also the mandate, right? So it's trying on multiple dimensions to get people to buy insurance. I don't know, actually. It's a good question if anybody has studied that, if there's been any kind of staggered rollout of these information campaigns for health insurance to see if they've been effective.
There's in particular, as a PhD student, I don't make choices about my health insurance. I just take what my school gives me. But my friends who are working, sometimes they're given a choice of 2 plans, sometimes they're given a choice of 20 plans. And they can be, you can imagine people who are well informed and are capable of reading the information, but it's still so difficult and time consuming to synthesize that, I don't know, I guess
Yeah, so I know in the health insurance debate, one alternative proposal that's come up is instead of the mandate trying to auto-enroll, right? So trying to use these sort of behavioral interventions rather than a mandate to nudge people in the right direction, but not force them to do something that they don't want to do, right? And I think ultimately it depends on, if your goal is to solve the adverse selection problem, then we have to think about with automatic enrollment, how sticky are people, how attentive are they, right? Are they going to, with something as big as health insurance, are they going to make different decisions? Will automatic enrollment be as effective in that context as in other contexts where it's proven to be highly effective?
Do you mind, just because it's about the same thing, I just want to point out, John Gruber has some stuff on this recently where they estimated the inefficiency of the choices of people on Medicare and how over the years they're able to calculate their actual use of their insurance versus what they're paying into it and show that they don't improve over time, that even though they have the opportunity to change their plans, they don't in ways that would normally be efficient, stuff like that. And so I think that gets a lot of this question of,
Yeah. Do you know how they, so I've seen this work in the past, but I haven't looked at it recently. How do they think about risk aversion? Because that's kind of the issue with deciding that people are making mistakes, right? It could be that I have very few health expenditures, but I buy a very generous plan because I'm extremely risk averse. And under my risk aversion, that's a rational decision.
so it's a pretty structural model, and they try to control for the risk aversion. So they calculate it, and it's built into the model. I think there's still a bit of a question of the identification between the risk aversion versus inefficiency.
Okay.
But they seem to think they've overcome that. So,
Okay.
so I read this, it's pretty recently came out, I think in 2016. So
Thanks for that.
Sure.
Yeah. You had a hand up.
Oh, I was just going to say, it seems like from this discussion, maybe on the ledger of value of insurance, there's something about time costs and saving many people individually from having to arrive at a difficult decision that doesn't change their outcome a lot, potentially. How much better would it be to make that as a group? And then, as you say, you don't even have to mandate it, you could let people change. And people who are motivated to do so won't find that choice so simple.
That's a good point. So we can weigh, I mean, some people would call that a time cost, other people would call that freedom, right, or something like that, or choice, right? And so that, yeah, they're two ways to.
Default is good for most people, but you still have the choice to switch. Argument.
That would be an argument for doing the auto enrollment. Yeah. I saw.
So how does informal insurance fit here? Do we consider if there's already something in place and then how they interact?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll touch on that a little bit in a few slides, thinking about informal insurance. And basically, we want to think about how costly was the informal insurance, right? If that informal insurance that people were using before the introduction of social insurance was very costly, then even if we don't see any change in outcomes, it could be that the introduction of social insurance was a good thing. Right? Important question. Yeah.
So when you say it's mandated, so how do you stand between mandating a social insurance and just providing it publicly and then let people choose whether to insure themselves?
Yeah, so it depends on your rationale, right? Which of these problems are you trying to solve, right? If you are, you think that the private market is there's under provision for some reason, then it might be that you can just subsidize health insurance or insurance and encourage that. If you're particularly concerned about adverse selection, for example.
Because it's like adverse selection, there could be also like advantageous selection.
There could be, right, absolutely. So we need to know which way the selection goes. Is the private market over-providing or under-providing insurance, right? So you could, instead of mandating, we talked about automatic enrollment, we talked about subsidizing insurance to encourage take-up. So I think I would say that it depends on which of these problems you find most compelling, right? As the reason behind government provision of insurance, right? Because it depends on which of these you find most compelling, and it depends on your preferences for this like choice or freedom parameter, right? That if you think mandating insurance is it's certainly going to make some people, almost certainly going to make some people worse off, right? Mandating insurance. And so how do you think about the people that you're making worse off by mandating insurance versus the people that you've made better off by reducing the cost of insurance? Okay. All right, so I want to start with the first question about the optimal generosity of the social safety net. Just touching briefly on theory. So the sort of formalized model that I'm not going to do today, but I would do in my class is the Bailey-Chetty model of insurance. And we often think of it as a model of social insurance, but it really is just a model we can think of it as a model of insurance. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about the intuition behind the theory, so that we can spend more time talking about empirical questions and empirical challenges. Okay. But the basic idea behind Bailey-Chetty is that these insurance programs have costs and benefits. And on the cost side, we talk about moral hazard. So eligibility rules can distort behavior. In the context of unemployment insurance, this means discouraging work or discouraging search effort. In the context of welfare programs, you hear the argument that these programs encourage single motherhood. In disability programs are in almost all countries conditioned on not working. So we give you disability payments, but we say that if you get disability, then you're not allowed to work. And if the reason people who get disability benefits aren't working is because of these rules, right, we're essentially distorting their behavior. There's somebody who can work, who would like to work, who is not working because of the marginal tax on earnings that we impose. On the benefit side, we call the benefit side consumption smoothing. So this is, again, because we're risk averse, we prefer a stable consumption stream to a volatile one or an unpredictable one. And precisely because we're better off, reducing consumption swings is going to make risk averse people better off. And I think empirically, the most important point in talking about this trade-off between moral hazard and consumption smoothing is that it's often not obvious what is moral hazard and what is consumption smoothing, right? So
I keep hearing this argument a lot from the economists about moral hazard. It seems like
you said from the economists. What are you? You're not an economist. What are you? You're political science. Okay. Actually, I'm curious. How many non-economists do we have? Okay. What are y'all's fields?
You guys can sit in the middle. It seems like all the non-economists are at the end.
Epidemiology. Or political science. Who else do we have? Okay.
demography.
Sorry?
Demography.
Cool. Did I miss anybody? All right. Okay, great. That's just for my benefit. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I keep hearing it a lot, and it seems like that has become like a major mathematic part of economic theory. I was wondering
Which part in particular?
let's say welfare programs being charged to one. Let's just take that as an example of moral hazard. But I was wondering about the studies that actually try to test it. Is it true that welfare programs are correlated with single motherhood that even just give birth without an adequate husband because they depend on their welfare programs? It seems like it's just a very simple plausible model. The same thing with reduction of job effort. Just like it seems to me that there is more in that decision to have a child as a single mother, in addition to James' work and
Yeah. Yeah. So these are that is why the word "may" features here. So these are theoretical effects. The empirical evidence is that unemployment insurance, yes, does discourage job effort and search effort. Although there's been more recent work thinking about that it improves, looking at improvements in match quality, for example. And then on the second point, welfare programs encouraging single motherhood, my read of the literature is that those effects are all pretty imprecise and inconclusive, that we have sort of imprecise estimates going in both directions, and that if there is an effect, at least, it's not big enough to detect it with precision. So that's sort of my read of it. So this is a great point, because there we definitely have evidence that disability insurance reduces labor supply. The question is why, right? And this is exactly the point that I'm getting at with this cautionary statement, that we don't know why that's happening. So it could be that, so what we've done so far is we've found some causal evidence of when you receive disability insurance, you work less. Okay. What we don't know is that moral hazard? Is that because if you worked more, we would tax your earnings, we would take away your benefits? Or is it just an income effect? Is it just that we gave you money, and so because you value leisure, maybe especially because you have a disability, right, working is very hard for you, you decide not to work once you get disability benefits. That is a non-distortionary transfer. That's what we would call consumption smoothing, that we made people better off by giving them disability insurance, right?
So the reason why I mentioned this is I don't want to get too political here, but so you should obviously very liberal place and more progressive, like seriously liberal, but these are like Republicans working towards lowering costs, like moral hazard, and it's just like it seems odd that they have appropriate ideas that are coming from a very liberal place and use them as political tools to sort of
So I don't think that's true. So I think that, so first, University of Chicago is not a liberal, not a bastion of liberal economics. I think, so first, these are two sides of a theoretical equation, right? So it's almost certainly the case that these programs have some perverse incentives, but our job as empirical social scientists is to quantify those perverse incentives and understand, are they big or are they small? They also almost certainly have, in theory, consumption smoothing benefits, where when we transfer income to people, they can stabilize their consumption, they can consume more, their health might improve, their overall well-being might improve, but we also need to empirically quantify those benefits. So the Oregon health insurance experiment, for example, looks at what are the effects of providing Medicaid to people on labor supply, but then also on their health and well-being. So the sort of effects that they find are that it's not doing much for physical health, but it is providing substantial improvements in mental health, and it's reducing the risk of financial crisis, of bankruptcy, for example. So those are sort of the consumption smoothing benefits of providing Medicaid. So my point here, right, is not, this is not political in any way. This is math, right? This is like how we set up the model. On both sides, we have to think about the cost side of the equation and the benefit side of the equation. And then the empirical, our goal as empirical social scientists should be to quantify both sides of that equation. So we can decide what is the optimal level of generosity. If, as you're saying, right, the perverse incentives are in fact very small empirically and the consumption smoothing benefits are very big, then the optimal amount of the optimal generosity is high, right? We should make these programs very generous. If the perverse incentives turn out to be very big and the consumption smoothing benefits small, the opposite. So this is a framework to help us think about, and this includes both the costs and the benefits of these programs, right? And what I was saying before was that in the unemployment insurance literature, we spent a long time thinking about only the cost side, and it's been only in recent decades that they've thought about the benefit side. And so it's absolutely important to do both and try to quantify both. All right. Okay, so the effect of these programs on labor supply, so after saying that you should work on things other than labor supply, I'm going to now talk a lot about labor supply. But so we went through this just now, that there's one channel through which these programs affect labor supply is an income effect, that because leisure is a normal good, when we transfer income, it's going to reduce work activity. And then substitution effects, incentive effects, moral hazard. Most of these programs have program rules that limit earnings. So with welfare programs, we're going to reduce the size of the benefit based on your earnings. With disability programs, we're going to condition your disability payments on not working. And then we also have to think about long-term dynamic effects. Okay, this is something that we have a lot less evidence on So I would say if you want to work on labor supply, this is a very nice area to work on, right? What are long-term or dynamic effects? And by that I mean that income and substitution effects are reducing labor supply today, right? So they're reducing labor supply today either because of program rules or because of the income transfer. That reduction in labor supply could have permanent effects if it is changing your preferences for work or leisure, right? If it's making you lazy, basically. If it's decreasing your human capital, so because you're out of the labor force, your skills erode, or if it's reducing your attachment to the labor market. We might see that even after you're no longer on the welfare program or the disability program, there's still permanent effects on your labor supply or your human capital because of these long-term dynamic effects. And these distinctions matter both for welfare and for policy. So in terms of welfare, they matter because, as we've talked about, right, income effects are non-distortionary. Income effects are just, if you transferred income to someone, what are the decisions about work and leisure that they would make for themselves? Whereas the moral hazard or substitution effects are when we have certain program rules, like telling people that they can't work above a certain amount if they're getting disability benefits, that's distorting their behavior. Right, so we're changing the relative price of work and leisure, and people are making a different decision as a result of that. Okay. It's also an important distinction for policy. So my favorite example of this is in the disability context. So the Social Security Administration, but also other disability agencies in the developed world have had a lot of focus on how do we get disability beneficiaries to work more? Most people go onto disability, and they're working very little. Okay, and so what SSA and other agencies have done is tried or experimented with making phase-outs more generous. So this is essentially saying instead of taxing your earnings at 50% when you start working, or rather taxing your benefits at 50% when you start working, we're either not going to tax your earnings or we're going to have a lower phase out. We're only going to tax them at 25%. So you can keep more of what you earn as you start working. And these policies have mostly been unsuccessful in increasing work activity. Okay, it turns out that when we change the program rules to allow people to keep more of what they earn, they don't end up working more. And one reason for that might be that empirically, substitution effects are small and the income effect is big. That the real reason that people aren't working when they get onto disability is just that the income transfer, right? They get this money. It might be that working is very costly for them because of their disability, and so they decide not to work. It's not that they're worried about losing their benefits if they start working. Okay. And so if the income effect dominates, then these policies to change the phase-out rate, to change marginal tax rates on earnings are not going to have the effect of encouraging work, right? So what should we, if the income effect dominates and we want to encourage work among disability beneficiaries, what should we do? What is the solution? It's simple. What's that? Exactly, lower the income transfer, right? So now we're kind of in this bind that if the income effect dominates, the only thing that we can do to encourage work among disability recipients is to reduce the amount of disability benefits, right? And that's obviously going to come at the cost of reducing the consumption smoothing value of disability benefits.
This result that you're citing empirically, is that sort of about disability claimers overall, or does it ever look at new decisions to claim? So maybe getting a bit into the dynamics part that you underscored. At some point, people have been out of work for too long, and we know this in the context outside of disability as well, just unemployment in general, maybe hard to get back in. But
Yeah.
for new people on the margin choosing whether to claim or not, or to work or not.
That's a great point. So if people already on disability have been out of work for a long time and there's no labor supply response because of low human capital, something like that, it could be that people who are, you could discourage entry, basically. Well, would you discourage entry? You would, you could at least encourage more work by allowing people who are coming in to get benefits under this different regime. Yeah.
It's challenging because it suggests, if that were true, that reducing the income amount subsidy to offset this problem we were talking about is essentially just punishing people who wouldn't be responsive.
That's right. So we don't know the answer to if we reduce benefits, how responsive would people be? And we certainly don't know the answer to if we reduce benefits, what would the cost to those people be, right? That we could look empirically at the labor supply effects, right? We could just look at their earnings, but it would be much harder to understand how costly was the reduction in benefits. How costly is it for them to go to work, right? Presumably that is why we have a disability insurance program, is that we think there are some people for whom work is so costly that we think that they should not be working, right? So yes, work is not the, as much as it comes up in the political debate, is not the only societal goal that we have, right? There's a reason that we have a disability program.
It could also be that there's an information problem, that people actually don't know about the reduction in the tax rate. I think there's a paper which uses this $600 cash payment in 2008 after the financial crisis. Suddenly people started actually filing their taxes because they wanted $600.
To claim that, yeah.
And then they suddenly encountered that they get $1,000 of EITC credits, and then they started 5 years after. So it's I don't know how large the effect is, I can't recall it, but could that be a same? Because
yeah, so that's possible. I don't know in this context how much effort they went through to make sure that people, they told people that we're now changing the policy such that you can keep more of your earnings when you work, but to what extent people internalize that information, right? We would ideally know that. If you did this experiment, you would want to do a survey to understand people's beliefs so that you can properly interpret the estimates. Yeah. Okay. And as I said, I think work on consumption, health, and well-being is very much needed in this area. So I want to walk through some empirical challenges in estimating consumption smoothing and moral hazard, and then I'm going to talk about one of my papers on the effect of removing kids from supplemental security income on labor supply, among other outcomes. Okay. So one empirical challenge in estimating consumption smoothing and moral hazard is what we've been talking about, right? That in general, what we're going to find when we try to estimate the effect of these programs on labor supply is we're just going to find some reduced form effect that incorporates both income and substitution effects, right? And we just went over why, both for welfare reasons and for policy reasons, we really ideally want to know the separate income and substitution effects. Okay, so this is another area where I think if studying labor supply, I think this dynamic question is very important. I also think this separating income and substitution effects. If someone can find a very compelling setting in which you can separately identify income and substitution effects, I think that would be a huge contribution to this literature. But in general, we don't have a lot of context in which that is true. Generally, when we transfer income, we do so conditionally, right? So you could think about an unconditional cash transfer program that would only measure income effects. But at least right now, in the developed world, we don't have a lot of that. Okay. So this Chetty and Looney paper, so this is something that, sorry, what's your name in the, or sorry, you in the pink? Dina, thank you. So you had mentioned informal insurance, and this is an important point because Chetty and Looney bring up the concept of endogenous consumption smoothing, right? That when we look empirically at the data, it might look like consumption smoothing hasn't changed. Consumption hasn't changed when we introduce an insurance program or a social safety net program. And so their example is in the when they compare Indonesia and the United States, what they find is that when somebody experiences job loss in the United States, you see some decline in consumption, and the United States is a country in which we have an unemployment insurance program, right? We can argue how robust it is. But then they go to Indonesia and they do the same exercise, and they look at, in Indonesia, when someone experiences a job loss, they find the same reduction in consumption as in the United States, right? And Indonesia is a country without a robust safety net, right? Where unemployment insurance is not available. And they sort of think, well, this is weird, right? There's one country where we have this unemployment insurance system, and yet consumption falls by the same amount in both countries. So what's going on? And this idea of endogenous consumption smoothing is what was the informal insurance that Indonesian job losers were using, right? So they basically report that in Indonesia, when someone loses their job, households are taking pretty dramatic action to try to smooth their consumption. They're taking their kids out of school and sending them to work, right? People might be working many jobs. Other people in the family might be working many jobs to try to smooth consumption. In the United States, because we have an unemployment insurance system, when a parent loses their job, they're not going to pull their kid out of school and have them start working, right? And so even though empirically, when we look in the data, there was no difference in the reduction in consumption in each of these countries, the unemployment insurance program in the United States might still be valuable because the informal insurance that people were using in Indonesia those sources of informal insurance were very costly, right? Having to pull your kid out of school and send them to work so that your household has enough to eat. That's a very costly consumption smoothing measure. If we were to introduce an unemployment insurance program in Indonesia, presumably people would not have to do that anymore, and that would be a social gain. So this is just to say that when we're doing empirical work on social insurance programs, right, we're going to have this problem of only seeing the reduced form, and we're also going to have this problem of not observing how costly it is for people to smooth their consumption. So another point is that consumption stability is also relevant if people are risk averse and if intertemporal smoothing is costly. So in addition to changing consumption levels, we might also be concerned about the stability of consumption over time. And to look at consumption stability, you're going to need long panels of income and consumption data, okay, which is, especially consumption data is a difficult thing to observe for long periods over time. Okay. And then other inputs into social welfare analysis. So again, these are the things that are much harder to observe in data, like health, subjective well-being, consumption, right? All of these things that we would need to do a true social welfare analysis. Okay. Yeah.
The difference between consumption smoothing and consumption stability.
Yeah. So consumption smoothing. What we're referring there is smoothing consumption across states of the world. So, right, that might happen to correspond with over time, but it's in the good state of the world when you have a job or you're healthy versus the bad state of the world when you lose your job or you get sick. Consumption stability is referring more to within person over time. And there's an important distinction there too, right, that there is variation, there's a difference between variation in consumption over time and versus unpredictability of consumption over time. If you had variation over time, but you perfectly knew that variation, you assuming you have access to credit markets, should be able to smooth that consumption over time. If your consumption is unpredictable, right, that adds another element of when we're risk averse, we don't like uncertainty.
Sorry, just real quick.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm familiar a lot with some of the consumption smoothing literature, but in recent years, what's sort of like the consensus about consumption smoothing, if you can summarize that?
No question. So I think in recent years, we've had a lot of work on, especially on public assistance programs. So Hillary Hoyne's work on food stamps. We had Anna Azer and co-authors on the Mother's Pension Program. So we've learned a lot about the long-term effects of these programs and intergenerational effects of these programs. And those results are that these programs seem to have large intergenerational effects. So the Mother's Pension programs, I'm not going to get the estimates exactly right, but they lead to higher labor supply. They lead to more longevity. The food stamp program, I think, also had gains in labor supply and measures of self-sufficiency. And so I think when I think about recent literature in this area, we're making a lot of progress on understanding longer-term effects of these programs. And it's always hard to make this conclusion because there's publication bias, but the evidence that we have seems to point in the direction of pretty substantial positive effects.
The positive effects towards their intergenerational consumption smoothing. I guess is what I'm trying to understand is like, so are people actually smoothing their consumption, or is this more a matter of we're able to help them smooth their consumption? And I guess this is the latter, right? That these programs are helping them with the consumption, their next generation's consumption and labor supply.
So this is getting at the distinction between insurance programs versus redistribution programs, right? That these are low-income kids who got benefits when they were kids, and then we see them as adults. That these programs had benefits on their work and their health and so on. And so, if we're using the term consumption smoothing generally to mean that this program is helping people that are in the bad state of the world by redistributing from people who are in the good state of the world, right? In that sense, it is helping society smooth consumption, right? Within individual, this is a little tricky because these are not true insurance programs, right? So we're not looking at, I think the distinction that you're making is, are people themselves sort of using the program to smooth consumption from a good state to a bad state. Is that right?
And that actually helps. I was thinking also just in terms of, med students have a sort of weird consumption smoothing rate, given that there's this huge investment up front, but then there's a big payoff in the end. And I was just wondering.
Well, graduate students, right?
Yes.
Like we should not be TAing and RAing. We should be borrowing. Anyways, we don't need to get into that. But.
And that's sort of what I was thinking about as far as like the sort of social welfare net, the safety net. I can see how it's plays in. So I'm good.
Okay.
I apologize, I don't know the Chetty and Mooney article, but do they provide a pathway to think about how to estimate those costs? So you said that it's cost of children going to work, but when we think about the counterfactual in the United States, is there any sort of path forward towards thinking about those costs, or is sort of the point that they're unobserved, we can't see them, and therefore we don't know?
Yeah. So the point of the paper, I think, is the latter. To make this point that when we just look at consumption, we could be missing a big part of the picture. If we look at a program and find that it has no, if John Gruber had written his paper on unemployment insurance and found, when you have more generous unemployment insurance, there's no effect on consumption. What can we conclude from that? And they, they do present a model in which basically what they're saying is you have to take into account both the delta C, the change in consumption, and then also the gamma, the risk aversion, right? You need to be able to scale by your gamma to understand if people are incredibly risk averse, even if the change in consumption that you observe is small, the program could still have very large benefits. So they're taking the Bailey-Chetty formula the, gamma times delta C, and they're just making the point that we really need to know both of these things to make, so we either have to know the cost of smoothing, or we have to know how risk averse people are, right? And we know that, there is estimates of risk aversion. There's a huge range of them. We have to think about what is the particular population that we're working in. But I don't know that they provide a solution to estimating the cost of consumption smoothing, but they're making the conceptual point that we either need to be able to measure those, or we have to know how risk averse people are to be able to interpret the change in consumption that we're observing. So I want to talk about a paper that was my job market paper, Does Welfare Inhibit Success? The long-term effects of removing low-income youth from disability insurance. And the main thing that I want to think about in this paper is applying those concepts of income effects, substitution effects, long-term dynamic effects. And then I'm also going to be able to say a few things about spillover effects to family members that we'll talk about in sort of that third question. So the Supplemental Security Income Program in the United States encapsulates this debate over welfare programs. So advocates of this, supporters of this program say that it's a critical lifeline for people who face barriers to employment. Critics of the program say that it discourages achievement, and especially for children and young adults could have, because they're in this formative stage of development, could have particularly adverse effects on their long-term development if it's discouraging effort, for example. Okay. SSI is a rapidly expanding program. It provides cash benefits and Medicaid eligibility to low-income children and adults who have disabilities. And it's a distinct program from the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, which you might also have heard about. So SSDI is sort of the true insurance program that you pay into when you're working, and then you get benefits when you become disabled. That's about $150 billion a year. And then SSI is a cash welfare program that's about $50 billion a year, and it does not require work history, just low income and assets. Okay, so there are two main questions that I'm addressing in this paper. The first is, how much does SSI inhibit labor market success and self-sufficiency among youth? So we have quite a bit of evidence on the labor supply effects of adult disability programs, but we know very little about how these programs affect children and young adults. Okay. And the second question that I want to think about in this paper is, how much insurance does SSI provide to recipients? So empirical work has focused mostly on the level of earnings and income, but the stability of income and the stability of consumption are also relevant, as we talked about, if people are risk averse. And earnings volatility is particularly relevant for low-income populations. So I'll show you a graph that shows basically that low-income people have the most earnings volatility. There's a lot of turnover in these jobs, and there's a lot of hours changes. Okay, so my context is looking at children who receive supplemental security income, and so comparing the SSI program to TANF, which is a traditional cash welfare program in the United States, you can see that SSI has expanded over time. So there was in 1984 a liberalization of medical eligibility criteria that led to an expansion of both disability programs. And then for TANF, you can see that after the 1996 welfare reform, actually before the 1996 welfare reform, it starts tapering off because of experiments that states were doing in advance of welfare reform, and also because of the economy gaining steam. So the effects of SSI might be particularly consequential for youth because they're very disadvantaged, right? So SSI kids they grow up in households with fewer than 2 parents, at incomes near or below the poverty line, and they're at risk for poor life outcomes. So they have dropout rates of around 1/2. in adolescence, they have arrest rates of around 30%, and their employment rates in adulthood are low, around 20 or 30%. Okay. And as we talked about, for this low-income population, we also want to consider income stability in addition to income levels. So the question I want to answer in this paper is, what are the long-term effects of removing low-income kids from SSI on their long-term earnings and income? Okay. And I'm going to use a regression discontinuity design based on a jump induced by the 1996 welfare reform law in the probability of removal from SSI at the age of 18. Okay. And I'm going to do this using administrative data from the Social Security Administration paired with this regression discontinuity design. Okay. So my data come from the Social Security Administration. I start with demographic and benefit history information for SSI kids. And then I'm going to link them to my instrument, which is medical reviews, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then I'm going to link the kids to various outcomes, so their earnings in adulthood, their DI and SSI applications and receipt in adulthood. And then I'm also going to link the kids to their parents so that I can look at the earnings of parents and then also some outcomes of siblings of these SSI children. Okay. So just some brief background on SSI. This program provides cash payments of around $9,000 a year and Medicaid eligibility to kids and adults who have qualifying disabilities. And importantly for my context, there's something called an age 18 medical review where a disability examiner decides whether an SSI child meets adult disability criteria. Okay. So for children, disability is defined in terms of age-appropriate activity, whereas for adults, disability is defined as an inability to work. And a condition like ADHD might qualify a child for disability because it interferes with age-appropriate activity like social interaction or school performance. It's much less likely to qualify an adult for disability. It's harder to argue that ADHD prevents all work activity, okay, which is the standard for adult disability. And nearly all of the recent expansion in the SSI Children's Program is coming from mental conditions other than intellectual disability. So this is mostly ADHD, speech delay, and autism spectrum disorder. And you should think of these age 18 medical reviews as disproportionately affecting kids with those types of medical conditions. So the context for this empirical strategy is rapid growth in the SSI Children's Program after the 1990 Supreme Court decision Sullivan versus Zebley. So the Supreme Court decision effectively relaxed medical eligibility criteria for kids and allowed kids with mental conditions like ADHD and speech delay to qualify for the program. Okay. Now, in the process of welfare reform, Congress looks at this rapid expansion in the SSI Children's Program and decides that they want to clamp down on this expansion, and they enact a number of measures to reduce entry into the program and also to remove kids that they believe had been improperly allowed onto the program. So as part of the welfare reform of 1996, Congress made two major changes to age 18 medical reviews. The first is that it required the Social Security Administration to redetermine the eligibility of all SSI kids at the age of 18, up from effectively 0 age 18 medical reviews prior to that. It also increased the age 18 eligibility requirements to use the adult standard rather than the child standard. So before welfare reform, if you were a child and you got an age 18 medical review, all the disability examiner had to show is that you have not demonstrated medical improvement. So you were essentially grandfathered on to the adult program as long as you didn't demonstrate medical improvement. Now a disability examiner has to use the adult standard and decide whether you qualify just as a new applicant based on the adult standard. Okay. And so both of these changes are going to apply only to children who have an 18th birthday after the date of welfare reform enactment, which was August 22nd, 1996. Right? That is the date that President Clinton signed the bill into law and declared an end to welfare as we know it. So the first thing that I want to check is that these changes in the legislation were actually implemented. Okay. And so this graph is showing you on the x-axis the date of the SSI child's 18th birthday. This vertical red line is August 22nd, 1996. And then the graph is plotting the proportion of kids in each of these birth week bins who receive an age 18 medical review. Okay. And what you can see is that this policy was very clearly enforced. So kids who have an 18th birthday just after the cutoff, about 90% of them are getting this age 18 medical review, whereas kids who have an 18th birthday just before the cutoff, very few of them are getting the age 18 medical review. Okay. Now, obviously, just because you get a medical review doesn't mean you're going to be kicked off the program, right? So there's some people who are going to get a medical review whose conditions are severe enough that they're going to qualify based on the adult standard. And so we also want to look at what is the effect on getting an unfavorable medical review, which means that the examiner decided that you don't meet adult criteria, and the discontinuity falls to 40 percentage points. Okay. Any questions about this? Because this is the whole thing. You can just like sleep through the rest because it's all just going to be outcomes. Yeah.
This is small, but I'm curious just for the top discovery.
Yeah.
Who are the people that don't even get a review?
Yeah, so those are people, so what I found in the data is that those are people who had already been flagged for some existing violation. So they were going to be kicked off anyways because they either violated income and asset limits or they violated reporting requirements. And so I think the idea was we don't want to waste money doing a medical review on kids who are going to be removed from the program anyway.
When it comes to one of the standards you said was as long as you don't show market health improvement. So do they take into account the effect of your ongoing treatment as being the cause of your market health improvement, such as if you had ADHD and you obviously probably need some medications to help deal with that. So you show market health improvement, but if you no longer afford those medications, I imagine you would go back to not showing market health improvement.
That's a great point, and it's been a source of a lot of controversy about what exactly the policy is and what, if you show health improvement, and does an examiner have an obligation to try to understand whether like removing the treatment would then cause regression of the condition, and I think my understanding is that the official policy is that examiners are supposed to consider the role of treatment. And the fact that SSI is providing access to Medicaid, for example, might be a consideration. But this is something that is not set in stone. So there's a lot of this is an important point. There's also just a lot of variation across examiners in, especially for conditions like ADHD, what their cutoff is in terms of severity. So there's the Massey-Smullen and Strand paper are in fact using variation in leniency across examiners to identify the effect of putting somebody on disability insurance, precisely because examiners vary in whom they're willing to put on the program, and also questions like this of whether they have to consider if removing your treatment would cause relapse, basically. That's a good question. Yeah.
Just a clarification question. Are there any further reviews after the age of 18? Or is basically disability insurance and so on state?
There are other reviews after 18, and that's actually going to be a very important point. I'm going to come back to that in 2 slides, I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the relationship of interest here is the effect of removing a child from SSI on their long-term outcomes, right? And this is exactly the debate over welfare programs. Does giving people welfare improve or worsen their long-term outcomes, employment, whatever you want to put on the left-hand side? And we have here basically an experiment in which we randomly kicked some kids off of welfare, and we randomly allowed some other kids to stay on welfare, and now we want to see in the long term, do those kids end up better off or worse off? Okay. So the parametric RD, this is just a standard parametric RD, so this is the first stage, whether you're removed from SSI. The running variable is date of birth, and we're interested in beta 1, which is the coefficient on having an 18th birthday after the date of welfare reform enactment. Okay, so we basically want to measure that discontinuity at the cutoff. Okay. So a number of tests of validity. We do covariate balance tests, some McCrary density tests, and we do permutation tests. And also assess robustness with respect to using a non-parametric RD and an RD with a second difference to adjust for seasonality. Okay. The sample is SSI children who have an 18th birthday around the August 22nd, 1996 cutoff, and that's about 80,000 kids in this sample. Okay, so the first thing that we want to look at.
Just some intuition for what it might be like to be a doctor with SSI. Could you tell us about what kind of benefits at or after age 18 people would be getting?
Yeah, so the benefits they're getting are, the maximum benefit is about $9,000 a year. And this is obviously pre-ACA expansion, and so for most of them, it's also going to mean Medicaid eligibility. So I'm not able to estimate a first stage for Medicaid, but just the observational difference is that 25% of SSI kids who get kicked off have health insurance as adults, and 75% do not. Whereas if you stay on SSI, almost 100% of kids will be enrolled in Medicaid.
I don't know the relationship well enough, but is SSI eligibility something that immediately makes you eligible for Medicaid? Or are you saying that because somehow that income isn't counted for Medicaid, you don't work?
In most states, it's an automatic eligibility. There are a few states in which you either have to go through a separate application process or there's a stricter standard for getting Medicaid. But in most states, you're automatically enrolled in Medicaid when you get SSI. And as you can imagine, pre-ACA expansion, that's a benefit here that I cannot measure empirically because I don't see Medicaid in the data. But that could be, potentially doubling the value of the SSI benefit. Okay, so the first stage here is the effect of this this discontinuity on whether you're enrolled in SSI. So here I'm showing you whether you're enrolled in SSI 4 years after the year that you were supposed to get this age 18 medical review. And there's about a 24 percentage point difference between the two sides. So remember that the side on the right-hand side, these are the kids who get the medical review. And the left-hand side, these are the kids who don't get the medical review. Okay, so you can see this 24 percentage point discontinuity that doesn't exist for the non-1996 cohort. So that's sort of a placebo check. Okay, so this is getting to your question. What is your name? Sorry? David. Thank you. Okay. So this is getting to David's question about other reviews that are going to happen in the future. So what I'm showing you here is I'm going to plot this discontinuity that I estimate in this graph for each year. Okay. And I'm just going to put all of those estimates on one graph. So you can see that before the age 18 medical review, before the 18th birthday, there's no difference between control and treatment in the likelihood of being on SSI, which should be true, right? If assignment to getting this age 18 medical review was random, and that's what we see. And then we see that this gap open up. That by year 4, right? There's that 24 percentage point difference between the control and treatment groups in the likelihood of being on SSI. Okay. And then what we see is a rapid attenuation of the first stage. Okay. And this is in part because of medical reviews that are happening after the age of 18. So what happened is this age 18 reform was part of welfare reform, and also as part of welfare reform, Congress allocated a lot of money to doing medical reviews for adults. So they were being very aggressive about adult medical reviews. And so a lot of the kids who don't get an age 18 review are going to end up being taken off the program in a future year because of an adult medical review. So there are a few things that are going into this attenuation. Some of them are good things, like you didn't pass your adult medical review, meaning you were too healthy, or you violated income and asset limits, which you were making too much money. And some of them are bad things. Some of them are you were incarcerated or you died. Okay. But this is going to affect our interpretation of the IV estimates over time, because what's going to happen is that each of the IV estimates at different points in time are going to be different, are going to be estimated off of different complier populations because of this change in the first stage, right? So if we think that all of the healthy and high-earning people have left the control group, right? That's going to leave a different control group in year 15 than we saw in year 4, and so we're going to have to basically, I'm going to reweight the estimates to try to make them reflect the same underlying population across these 15 years. Okay. It's going to turn out not to matter very much, but conceptually, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay. I also just conceptually want to talk about what is the correct endogenous variable in this case, and I think this is something that we don't talk about enough, but it comes up a lot in empirical work, right? So the attenuation of this, of the effect on SSI enrollment complicates the interpretation. So we sort of have two choices here, right? So we could, when we think about what is the correct endogenous variable, we could say the correct endogenous variable is just whether you got kicked off at the age of 18 as a result of your age 18 medical review, okay? And that, using that endogenous variable is going to require fewer assumptions to meet our exclusion restriction, okay? Because we don't have to think about, we can safely say that any effect of the instrument, the being on the right or the wrong side of that discontinuity on your labor supply outcomes or your future outcomes is operating solely through whether you were kicked off the program when you were 18. Okay, that seems like a reasonably safe assumption to make. But the problem is that it's not very useful for interpretation, right? So just as a policy parameter, the effect of kicking somebody off of SSI at the age of 18 is not that useful to know if we know that in the interim, a lot of other things could happen to them, right? They might be kicked off as a result of getting a medical review in the future, right? There are a lot of things in the future that could change that would affect our interpretation of the reduced form estimate. The other alternative that we have is to use contemporaneous SSI enrollment. So just, were you enrolled in SSI in this year? We use that as the endogenous variable for your labor supply or your other outcomes in a given year, okay? And the trade-off here is that this endogenous variable is going to require stronger assumptions, right? It's going to require us to assume that the only way that being on either side of that discontinuity affected your outcomes in a certain year is through whether you were currently enrolled in SSI in this year. Okay, so it's basically saying that the only way that your labor supply outcome, the instrument affects your labor supply outcomes in year 10 is whether you were on SSI in year 10, right? But you might imagine that there are, there are cumulative effects on health or cumulative effects on human capital, that it doesn't matter only whether you were on SSI in a given year, but that a lot of things that have happened since then, these cumulative effects also affect your labor supply in year 10. Okay. But it is a more policy relevant interpretation. It is more meaningful to say what is the effect of somebody being on SSI in a given year, right? That's like a parameter that a policymaker would find useful rather than what is the effect of kicking somebody off of SSI at 18 when it could be that they're going to later be kicked off at age 25, and we wouldn't account for that if we used the first endogenous variable. Does that sort of make sense? So this comes up also in like Oregon health insurance experiment. They have a long discussion about what is the appropriate endogenous variable in their context. Is it are you on Medicaid right now because of this lottery? Is it have you been on Medicaid for the last 3 years continuously, or how many years have you spent on Medicaid? Have you ever been on Medicaid, right? And so what they do is I sort of take a page from their book and just say, well, we're going to look at this using a few different endogenous variables, and you can choose your favorite, right, depending on what assumptions you were willing to make about the exclusion restriction. Hillary, you had a question.
I'm sure you did, but the role of lags in this, like instead of the contemporaneous SSI enrollment, whether you were enrolled 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I don't know how you might like run up against the sort of first endogenous of age 18 removal, but I could see something like a 5-year, 3-year window being.
Right. So what I did is also a sort of compromise endogenous variable of cumulative years on SSI. And it turns out that that gives you very, very similar results to using contemporaneous SSI enrollment. So it doesn't look like there are lots of cumulative effects, but right, conceptually, this could matter.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. Okay.
Any other questions about this? At this point? Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so now outcomes. This is sort of just the part where we get to look at a lot of graphs and talk about these different effects. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the youth's own earnings in adulthood. And this is where we're going to think about these income effects and substitution effects and long-term dynamic effects. So here the income and substitution effects should work in the same direction, where these kids are losing a bunch of income because SSI was taken away from them, and so we should expect them to work more for that reason. And also their earnings are no longer subject to SSI's 50% marginal tax rate. And so that should also work in the direction of encouraging work. We'll be able to get a sense of long-term or dynamic effects because I'm going to be able to look over 15 years to see how their earnings response evolves over time. Okay. So this is the reduced form graph for earnings in adulthood. The RD estimate here is saying that the kids who are on the right-hand side, who are more likely to get a medical review, their average earnings in adulthood are $300 higher annually than kids on the left-hand side who don't get a review. Okay, this estimate really shouldn't mean anything to you, right? Because this is a reduced form estimate that's very hard to interpret. This is just saying if you're on either side of this discontinuity, how much more do you earn in adulthood? To make it more meaningful, we really want to scale up by the first stage, or at least we want to compare the reduced form for the loss in SSI income to the gain in earnings, okay? And so this is, again, over time. And what I find is that youth who are removed from SSI recover about 1/3 of the lost SSI income in adulthood. So we think about that, that $9,000 cash benefit in adulthood. You can think about them recovering about 1/3 of that in earnings once they're removed from the program. Okay, so this is, to me, is the most sort of important graph of the paper. So this is showing us, trying to show us levels in addition to changes. Okay, so what this graph is doing is the gray series here is the control mean. This is the control group, the group that stays on SSI, their annual earnings over time. And then the orange series here is adding to that the IV treatment effect so that it's reflecting the earnings of SSI youth who are actually removed from the program. Okay. And what you can see is that the earnings of the removed SSI youth are low, right, around $4,000 a year, and they're also incredibly flat. So I think it would be hard-pressed to find another population whose earnings trajectory is this flat. Okay. You might look at this graph and say, well, we know that SSI youth are very disadvantaged, right? They come from poor households, and it might be the case that this just reflects sort of standard labor market outcomes for kids who grow up in poverty. Okay. So what I want to do next is I want to compare these removed SSI youth to youth who are disadvantaged but not disabled. Okay. So the lighter green series here is youth who were denied, who applied for SSI but were denied based on being too healthy. So these denied SSI applicants, these are kids who are poor enough to be considered for SSI. They got through sort of the technical requirements for SSI, but they were too healthy to be approved for the SSI program. Okay, so this is an example of a disadvantaged but non-disabled youth group. And then the darker green series is youth whose families were on AFDC or TANF when they were young. Okay, so another disadvantaged but non-disabled group of youth. And what you can see is that relative to the SSI youth, these disadvantaged but non-disabled youth also have low earnings but substantially more robust earnings growth over time.
So are all these 1996 cohorts other than the control?
denied SSI applicants are no. So they are a mix of cohorts. And that's why their earnings trajectory is so smooth, because it's not taking into account year effects, essentially. The NLSY cohort, I believe, is similar. I selected them to be similar in age to the
That's how you
to
see
the 1996
1996
cohort.
National elections.
Yeah. This is NLSY.
One thing I'm wondering about is to what extent you could look later too, like people, so your control, just backing up, sorry, your control is pre-1996 years, like 95, 96?
No, these are the kids on the left-hand side of the discontinuity.
So in earlier years? No.
So these are these kids. These kids are my control group.
I see.
Does that make sense? So I'm just plotting the level of the control, and then I'm adding the IV estimate to the level.
So change comes into effect. I see. So they could be reviewed later, maybe, and you're going to maybe get to that.
That's correct. So
Okay.
this is going down, right? So this is a little bit complicated, right? Because these, as we talked about, this complier population, this control group, is changing over time. So I do a reweighting exercise. There's a button that says reweight, if you believe me. The orange line will go up a little bit, but not dramatically.
So then, I guess as a comparison, so it sounds like the things you're comparing on that graph of 4 lines all seem useful together. But the one thing I was going to ask about is if you were to look later in time, so people who are still affected by this policy change,
Yeah.
but could have maybe anticipated this. I'm wondering to what extent families or the kids themselves may have perceived what would happen to them in adulthood differently when it was no longer a given that they would qualify for SSI.
That's a great question, and that's exactly something that I'm working on right now, is trying to provide information. So if you talk to counselors, they say that a lot of families still don't know about the age 18 medical review, and so I'm working with Rebecca Dizon-Ross, who's at Booth, to try to give information to families about the likelihood of removal at 18 and see if they make different human capital investment responses. But that's a great point, right? That this is an unexpected policy change. In interpreting these estimates, we have to consider that when these kids got kicked off at 18, they presumably believed that they were going to stay on SSI for the rest of their lives, may not have made the same human capital investments that they would have made if they had known in advance that they were going to get removed from the program. So that's a very important interpretation point, absolutely.
I noticed you had on the previous graph, you had.
Sorry, can you say that again?
On the previous graph, I noticed you had something on heterogeneity. Can you explain a bit more about that?
That I had something
On heterogeneity.
on heterogeneity. Oh, yeah. Okay, so these average effects are masking a lot of heterogeneity, basically. So there isn't a lot of heterogeneity on observables, but what I find is that there is a lot of heterogeneity on unobservables, essentially. That there's 10% of these kids are going to earn at what we might consider self-sufficiency wages, full-time, full-year minimum wage levels, $15,000 a year. And the other 90% are going to earn zero or very little. And so these averages are definitely masking heterogeneity. I think the problem for public policy is that we can't predict on observables, at least not the observables that we currently collect on these kids, which of the kids are going to be the 10% that do well or okay, and which of the kids are going to basically fail in the labor market, right? And so there is heterogeneity, but not a lot of heterogeneity that is predicted by observable characteristics.
So whether they have their immigration status or?
So I have parental earnings. So there is some variation with respect to parental earnings. Kids whose parents earn more earn more in adulthood. But there's not really any heterogeneity with respect to diagnosis, with respect to severity, with respect to how long they've been on SSI, with respect to local economic conditions. And I should point out, when I say local economic conditions, this is a change that's happening in the late 90s when the economy is booming, right? And we would expect if there's any time that these kids are going to be successful in the labor market, it's going to be in the late 90s. And we still see that them entering at very low wages, and then also, their low wages continue. This dip, by the way, is is the Great Recession. So because this is one cohort, you can see calendar year effects in these earnings, and so you can see the effect of the Great Recession, which is even more striking if I were to show you the like cutoffs, like earnings above 15K would be a more dramatic drop
Do you have grades?
in that age.
Do you have like high school grades or?
I don't have high school grades. Yeah, no, I don't have anything about achievement. Yeah, yeah. Most of these, so the relevant margin for these kids is whether they finish high school. But that would be nice to see if there's some underlying measure of ability.
Can you show the poverty rates for these 4 lines?
Say that again?
The poverty rates for these 4 lines, can you show those? To see how far behind.
Yeah, so this is only earnings, and I used to have a slide on sort of poverty rate, but there's only some measures of income that I observe. So I observe earnings, and then I observe their disability income essentially, and I'm not going to observe other sources of income. I'm going to get to that in a few slides, but that's going to make it a little bit complicated to calculate the poverty rate. Okay, I'm going to.
Sorry, I have one question.
Yeah.
I think it's regarding Robert's point before. So the 2 green lines, they're not the 996 cohorts. So there might be some.
So these kids are basically the 96 cohort.
Are they also 96 cohorts?
But these kids are not.
Okay, so that one could have some kids that are like at age 18 later in life, and they already made kind of human capital decisions when they got to know about this change of the reviews.
Well, so the review is not relevant to these kids, right? So the point of the exercise here, these green lines, is just to compare earnings levels. And so this graph was a graph about changes, and this is a graph about levels. And so I just wanted to show you the comparison of levels for the SSI kids versus other disadvantaged but non-disabled kids. Yeah.
Do you have the average annual earnings for just the average person who was in this 1996 cohort that wasn't necessarily on any of these programs, but just, out of the entire population, I guess, or an estimate of that average?
Well, so that's what this is trying to do. So the average will be higher because these 2 groups are disadvantaged groups. Is that what you're getting at, or?
So I'm referring to kids who were in this cohort but weren't on any of these programs.
Okay.
Just like the average 1996 cohort person, if that makes sense.
Chris, how much does an average 18-year-old make? You know this, right?
What?
How much does an average 18-year-old make?
I don't know. I mean, you mean somebody that's, I was only half paying attention.
That's okay.
that's working full time?
Yeah, I think that's the question.
Yeah, that would be fine, yeah.
So the question was just, I'm using this comparison to disadvantaged kids here, and your question, sorry, what your name is? Ben. Ben was asking about the average kid.
Yeah,
What?
it's probably like 30K or something like that.
Okay, so a lot more than this here. Full-time, your minimum wage is about 15K. Yeah, so if they were earning minimum wage, then, yeah. Okay, I'm going to press on so that we can take a break soon. So I'm going to. Parental earnings, I find that parents don't respond very much to their child being removed from SSI, and so if we think that this is a household decision that's being made, somebody's consumption is probably falling, right? Either the parents or the kids, because total observed household income is falling as a result of SSI removal. Okay. Income volatility. So again, the reason we might care about this is if people are risk averse. We care about the volatility of their income in addition to the effect on the level of their income. So this graph is just showing you that income volatility is higher at the bottom of the earnings distribution, or rather earnings volatility is higher at the bottom of the earnings distribution. Okay, so the kids that we're talking about in this paper are almost all going to be in this first earnings quintile. So I'm going to estimate the effect of this of the removal on the coefficient of variation. We can talk about other other ways to measure volatility, that's important, right? So the coefficient of variation is standard deviation normalized by the mean. The reason I want to normalize by the mean here is that there's a big drop in average income as a result of being removed from SSI, and so I want to normalize, I want to sort of partial that out when I think about income volatility. But there are also arguments for looking at just the standard deviation or non-normalized measures of income volatility, okay? And the results still go in the same direction, but are less robust when you use those other measures of income volatility. So I should say that income volatility, quickly, that income volatility is something that you hear a lot about when you read like the sociology literature. You hear welfare recipients saying things like, I could get a job, could go off of welfare and get a job, but it's very likely that I'm going to lose that job in a few months or a year, and so the stability that welfare provides is important for my family. If anybody of you have read Matt Desmond's book, Evicted, he talks a lot about SSI recipients in that book, and the fact that SSI recipients are attractive to landlords because SSI income is much more stable than earnings for low-earning populations, right? That landlords know for an SSI recipient that income is stable, and so they're going to pay their rent every month, and that's not necessarily true for people whose primary source of income is wages. Okay. So two other things I want to talk about are sibling earnings in adulthood. So the caveat here is that I can't see all of the siblings. I can only see siblings who were themselves on SSI at some point. It turns out that that's a lot of siblings. Okay, so it turns out that 25% of the 18-year-olds are going to have a sibling who is on SSI. And that's not conditional on having a sibling. That's just an unconditional mean. And so I'm going to look at the earnings of those younger siblings in adulthood, and I'm going to find that the younger siblings of the kids who get a review and are more likely to get removed, those younger siblings have lower earnings in adulthood. So this is mean sibling earnings in adulthood. And you can also see this discontinuity at the cutoffs, like sibling earnings above $5,000 a year in adulthood. Okay. And so this is difficult to interpret because there might be a few things going on. The sort of most obvious explanation is that the 18-year-old's SSI income was paying for basic household necessities, and the younger sibling experiences this drop in household income, and their human capital development or something like that is adversely affected by this large drop in household income. And just to give you a relative sense, parental earnings in the year that the child turns 18 is about $9,000 a year. And so at least in terms of observed income, this SSI income, it could be about half of observed household income. There could be sources of income that I'm not observing, okay, but it's a substantial amount. Okay. But the other potential explanation is that these kids themselves are on SSI and they're doing some updating about the likelihood that they're going to stay on SSI or not stay on SSI in adulthood, and making adjustments accordingly. Okay, so we can't interpret this result in a purely IV framework because, again, multiple endogenous variables potentially, and only one instrument. All right, the last outcome, intergenerational outcomes. So I can see whether an 18-year-old is ever listed as a parent on their child's SSI record. So essentially, I can look at all the child SSI records in recent years and see is the 18-year-old from my original sample ever listed as a parent on one of those children's records. Okay. And what I find here is that for women, for the female 18-year-olds, right, about 20% of them have a child who is on SSI later. But what I don't find is any discontinuity across the cutoff. So there doesn't seem to be any causal effect of removing the 18-year-old on the likelihood that her child is on SSI. For men, the correlation is lower. So this is about 4% of men have a child on SSI. A lot of these men are non-custodial men. Okay, so they're not going to be listed on their child's SSI record. Okay. And then the last thing I want to say is that income is not the same as consumption. I've given you various measures of income, earnings, disability receipt, but we also want to think of other sources of consumption, in-kind receipt from family members, right? We want to think about non-disability public assistance, and we want to think about unreported earnings. And in-kind and monetary transfers, that's probably a large source of consumption for these youth. Non-disability public assistance is probably a smaller amount of consumption for these youth, again, because they're mostly men and mostly minorities and unlikely to be eligible for a lot of public assistance other than disability. Okay. And unreported earnings is just going to be kind of a problem that we're not going to love to get administrative data on unreported earnings, but in the absence of that was a joke. In the absence of that, we sort of can't know how big that is. Okay, so I will stop there just to say that with respect to the first question, does SSI discourage labor market success and self-sufficiency? These removed SSI youth are earning, pretty minimal amounts in the labor market, and their earnings growth rate is very low. And then with respect to insurance, I do some welfare calculations to sort of calculate how much of the effect of this policy is coming through income supplementation versus income stabilization, and find that up to 1/4 of the value of SSI is coming from that income stabilization component rather than just income supplementation. All right, so apologies for going over. So I think we'll take a 30-minute break and then we come back. Does that sound right? The dilemma that we have in this targeting question is, right, that we can't have a society in which everybody gets government transfers, in which everybody is a net recipient of government transfers, because then if everybody gets benefits and nobody works, there's just mechanically there's nothing to redistribute or allocate, right? And so ideally we would be able to perfectly observe ability and just transfer based on ability. So we would rank people by ability, and then we would say, you high ability people, you have to work, and then we're going to redistribute the taxes that we get from you from working to these low ability people who don't have to work. Okay. Obviously, we don't perfectly observe ability, and so we might end up giving benefits to people who appear to be deserving, appear to be low ability, but are not in fact low ability. Okay, there's no incentive compatible way to get people to declare their ability. So this relates to the moral hazard concept that we talked about from Bailey-Chetty, where we're going to create an incentive to distort consumption. So we're distorting consumption in the good state, right, by taxing people when they're working, and in the bad state. So we're taxing the people who work, and then we're giving benefits to the people who don't work, right? And that's going to create incentives to basically to masquerade, right, as low ability. And so instead of just weighing moral hazard costs against consumption smoothing benefits, we're now going to ask if we can design programs in a way that reduce the moral hazard effects of these programs, right? And remember that the benefit of reducing the moral hazard effects is that if we can reduce the moral hazard effects of these programs, we can make them more generous. We can increase their consumption smoothing benefits, and that's so we can basically have an optimal level of benefits that's more generous, that delivers more consumption smoothing benefits without increasing those moral hazard costs. So remember our iron triangle. When we have just the amount of the government transfer and the marginal tax rate, we can't achieve all three objectives of reducing program costs, encouraging work, and redistributing income, right? So if we want to encourage work by reducing our marginal tax rate, we're either going to have to spend more because we have to pay people that are higher in the income distribution, or we do less redistribution of income. And what this section basically on targeting is about is let's introduce more instruments to try to break that iron triangle, to make it such that we can give a targeted population of people more generous benefits. Okay, so that we don't have to, we can increase generosity without increasing overall spending because we're targeting those benefits to the people who need them the most. So there are sort of three ways that we know of conceptually to target benefits. The first is tagging, using observable characteristics that are correlated with ability as a condition of receiving benefits, right? So we do this a lot. In the United States, we use being a child is a tag, single motherhood, disability, low income. And we're not going to talk in detail about tagging today, but the sort of empirical example that I use in my class is the Mastis-Mullen-Strand paper where it's basically looking at using disability as a tag and what is the effect of putting people on disability on labor supply outcomes. Okay. Although that's not the, again, as we talked about, that's not the only outcome that we would care about. If we cared about how effective is this tag, we would also care about a lot of other outcomes. What we're going to focus on today is the concept of screening. So designing a program to get low ability individuals to select into a program and discourage the high ability people from entering the program. And some ways that we do this are through what we call ordeals, so making people go through hassles like filling out paperwork and standing in line. And the idea is that people with a high opportunity cost of time aren't going to want to waste their time doing those things. And so we screen them out, and only the low ability people with a low opportunity cost of time are going to be left. And we can also think about in-kind transfers as a way of designing programs to target people who need them the most. So, if cash, because it's the most fungible, right, is highly desirable, if we instead transfer using in-kind goods like public housing or food stamps, it might be the case that low ability people value those in-kind transfers more than high ability people do. And so again, we're going to discourage the high ability people from entering the program. Again, these are hypotheses, right? These are theories, and so what we need is empirical evidence to think about, is that true? Because we could also write down a model where exactly the opposite is happening, right? That in-kind transfers or ordeals are screening out the low ability people, precisely the people that we want on these programs. Okay, so we'll talk briefly about some theory from Nichols and Zeckhauser. Last time I gave this talk, Stephen Durloff made fun of me because I said that paper is my favorite paper in economics, but I still stand by that claim. So you guys can read it for yourself and decide. That paper has motivated some of my empirical work, and I'll talk about one of those papers in particular, Deshpande and Lee 2017, where we look at the effect of Social Security field office closings, so places where people go to get help with their disability application. These offices close. The cost of applying for disability weekly increases. What are the effects of those closings on take-up and targeting of disability programs? And then the third sort of policy that we can use is improving outside options. So I'm not going to have a lot to say about this, right? The idea here is that we increase the return to work, we increase wages, so that work is more attractive relative to government transfers. Okay, so we could do that through training, labor market subsidies, childcare. These are things you're going to hear more about or have already heard about in other lectures this week. Okay, I'm just going to skip that and move on to, so just a brief overview of tagging. So under our social welfare function, we want to redistribute consumption, utilitarian social welfare function, we want to redistribute consumption from high ability to low ability, but we don't observe ability, right, as we talked about. And so we're going to use tags, observable characteristics that are correlated with ability, but are less changeable than income, and redistribute based on those characteristics, right? And so single motherhood and disability are correlated with ability, and we use those to target benefits. Okay, that's why we have a disability program. TANF benefits are mostly targeted at single mothers. Of course, they aren't perfectly correlated with ability, right? Some single mothers or people with disabilities have high earnings potential, and then some people who don't fall into those categories have low earnings potential. And the United States has largely opted to redistribute on the basis of tag. So we talked in the previous section about these SSI youth who grow up. They're mostly men and mostly minorities, and they're not eligible for a lot of public assistance besides disability in the United States, because in the US we largely condition government transfers on being a child or living with a child. Okay, so the advantages of tags, so the Akerlof 1978 model is kind of the canonical tagging model. And what comes out of that is the advantages of tags are that they can improve targeting and reduce government spending. And they're correlated with, like income, they're correlated with ability, but less changeable than, like income, they are correlated with ability, but they're less changeable than income, right? So this idea of the perfect tag being both correlated with ability and immutable, right? You might remember about 10 years ago, Greg Mankiw and Matt Weinzierl proposed the height tax, right? So we should tax people based on their height because height is correlated with ability, and it's also something that's very difficult to change, right? And so this was sort of became this is obviously kind of funny when you first think about it, right? But the point that they were making is that a lot of the objections that you would have to a height tax, like that it's not perfectly correlated, it is correlated with ability, but not perfectly correlated with ability, also apply to all the other tags that we use, right? It also applies to single motherhood and to disability and to living with children, right? So the disadvantages of tags are, first, that they might be more costly to administer. So this is particularly true in the disability context, that it's very expensive to pay people, right? This is not really a scalable thing. You have disability examiners going through every single applicant's medical records to decide if they qualify for disability. And the administration of that program is very expensive. And a disadvantage of the tag is that depending on how changeable the tag is, right, the tag itself could create perverse incentives. So you're solving one moral hazard problem by introducing the tag, but you might be creating other moral hazard problems. So, right, so Nick Kristof, the New York Times columnist, he has this article from op-ed from, I think, 2012 on SSI, where he goes to rural Appalachia, and he finds these two families who say that they have taken their kids out of literacy programs because they're afraid if their child learns how to read, they're going to be taken off of the SSI program. We don't know from that story whether this is a systematic thing or whether Nick Kristof went to rural Appalachia and found two families who said that they were doing this. And then based on that, calls for entirely defunding the SSI children's program. So that seems like bad social science. But his point, right, the larger sort of conceptual point is that the tag itself might create perverse incentives. And that's something I should have, I think it's relevant to go back to the paper that we just looked at and think about what that means in the context of this paper. So that paper that I showed you was saying that when you take kids off of SSI at 18, they do very poorly in adulthood, right? And there are two interpretations of what's going on. One is that this SSI program is very good at targeting kids who are going to do poorly in life. And so that's why when you take them off of SSI, you see them doing very poorly in life. Another potential interpretation is that, that the critics of the SSI program might agree with is the reason that when you take kids off of SSI at 18, they do poorly in life is that you've discouraged achievement up to the age of 18, and so by the time they reach 18, their human capital is so poor that you take them off of SSI, and then they fail in the labor market, right? But even if you subscribe to the second interpretation that the SSI program itself is sort of messing them up for life, the policy conclusion is not obvious, right? So one policy conclusion is what Nick Kristof says, which is get rid of this program. Another policy interpretation is don't make the program conditional on disability, right? If that's the problem, if the fact that you were tagging based on disability and the parents have to show that their kids are disabled and that's what's discouraging achievement, right? If that is what is having adverse effects on kids, then one solution is get rid of the program, but another solution is make the program unconditional on disability, remove the tag. It becomes a more expensive program because it's not as well targeted, right? But this is just to say that just because tagging has perverse incentives doesn't mean necessarily that a program should not exist. An alternative policy conclusion that one could make is that we should just get rid of the tag that we were using, right? So this is an argument for, one argument for unconditional cash transfers, right? If we think that the tag itself is creating perverse incentives, a possible response to that is not to condition on the tag. Okay, so I want to spend most of our time talking about screening, and the difference here, right, is that the tag was an observable characteristic that we were using to restrict benefits to a particular population. In screening, instead of restricting benefits to a particular population, we're instead going to try to design a program such that it's attractive to people that we want on the program and it's unattractive to people that we don't want on the program. So the Nichols and Zeckhauser paper, my favorite paper, talks about this trade-off between productive efficiency and targeting efficiency. Right? And the idea behind all of their, all of the policies that they analyze is to make the program burdensome or unappealing such that low ability types are a little bit worse off, which induces some productive efficiency. But high ability types are much worse off by going through these ordeals, and so they're not going to want to enroll. So the idea is that, and we, in my class, we would go through this the arguments formally, but the idea is that you're going to sacrifice a second order loss in productive efficiency by making people jump through these hoops, like filling out paperwork and standing in line and restricting their earnings. And in return, you're going to get a first order gain in targeting efficiency. So it's because those things are going to be costlier for the high ability people than the low ability people, you end up targeting your benefits to the low ability people, and you can increase the amount of the benefit, the generosity of the benefit, because it's now better targeted at the people who need it. Okay. So the paper, this theory paper, rationalizes several types of seemingly perverse program design. So they take a lot of features of programs that we generally look at those things and we say, why do we do this, right? This seems incredibly inefficient to give people public housing instead of just giving them cash, or to restrict their earnings to a very low amount if they want to get benefits, or to make them stand in line for hours or fill out complicated paperwork. And so this paper goes through each of those types of policy bugs, which they say might be features, okay, and their argument for them being features rather than bugs. So with respect to restrictions on earned income, right, so transfer programs generally restrict recipient earnings a lot, right? They have very high marginal tax rates. So as we've talked about, once you start working, we start taxing your benefits. We start taking your benefits away, and that's distortionary, right? If we want to encourage human capital development among welfare recipients, we should have a lower marginal tax rate, right? We should allow them to keep more money. That would encourage them to work, maybe, right? We talked about empirical evidence in the context of the disability program where that didn't appear to be the case. But in principle, if you reduce substitution effects, these distortionary substitution effects, you could encourage human capital development. And their argument is that by having these strict limits on recipient earnings, we're discouraging high ability types from entering the program, right? So if we had a welfare program where you could earn up to $100,000 and keep your benefits, it's going to be a very poorly targeted program, right? Because we're going to end up paying a huge number of rich people, and those rich people are going to make a lot of money and collect welfare benefits, right? And so what they're saying is that if you restrict earnings to a very low amount, which essentially amounts to having a very high marginal tax rate, what happens is that the high ability people, the people who can make $100,000 a year, they're going to say, forget this. I'm not going to like reduce my earnings to $5,000 a year just to be able to get these benefits. And your program is going to be better targeted. Okay. So they are not denying that you're imposing costs on the low ability people. So in their model, there is a second order productive efficiency loss, in which even the low ability people would prefer to earn more than the $5,000 limit or whatever it is, right? And so you are incurring some productive efficiency loss. But what they say is that that's a second order relative to the first order targeting gain, because those low ability people, even if they could earn more than $5,000, it wouldn't be that much more than $5,000, right? Whereas the high ability people, if they can earn $100,000, that's a huge productive efficiency loss to them that they're not going to want to incur, and therefore they're not going to sign up for the program, and therefore we're going to get a big improvement in targeting efficiency. Okay. Yeah.
Can you give us a sense across different programs of the magnitude of verification costs that these programs face? And then it's not like offhand, but
yeah.
Maybe there's one program you know well, or it's been looked at by
So do you mean with respect to earnings in particular, or do you mean with respect to tags, or?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because the disability program, that was about, so in the disability program, the fixed cost of setting up the infrastructure to verify people's earnings is high, but the marginal cost once you have that infrastructure is pretty trivial, right? So like verifying income, verifying assets is harder. So for SSI, they also have to verify assets, which is much harder than verifying income. But it's really the cost of determining disability eligibility that is the big administrative cost in the disability system. It's a good question. It's also something that we will get back to in the paper that I'm going to present, which is that one reason that we think targeting the disability program or designing program rules appropriately in the disability program is so important is that we don't have an easy way to verify health status, to observe health status or to verify health status, right? That is, if we design a program such that it's unattractive to people with severe medical conditions, then we really have no way of finding those people. So that's a slightly different question than what you're asking, but it's still about how observable are the tags that we're trying to use to determine eligibility.
Yeah, and the challenge too with assets, I guess, when I see that only SSI is trying to verify assets or something, it's not clear whether that's just not relevant to other programs or whether a decision is made that it's not worthwhile. It seems more likely.
In other programs?
In other programs.
So so Medicaid, for example, especially long-term care, right? They have this look-back period where they have to not only verify your assets at the time, they also have to they have to go back, I think, 5 years to look at whether you've made any gifts, for example, to your kids, which is not allowed, right? So you can't just like give your kids all your money and then go on Medicaid. But that's a substantial amount of work to look back for 5 years at all of your bank statements, all of your other financial information to decide whether you meet this requirement.
I was wondering about the other line, a little worse off. So I'm curious as to who decides and how is it decided what a little worse off constitutes. So
Yeah.
a little worse off for me, if I don't have a disability, who decides how worse off I should or can get?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, great question, because again, this is the theory, right? This is the model that they're writing down, in which the reason they're arguing, like in the context of restrictions on earned income, the reason they're saying a little worse off is that they're assuming that the low ability people can only earn so much, right? So let's say that the low ability people, their potential earnings are $8,000 a year. right, if we cap earnings in this program at $5,000 a year, what they're saying is that, you know, they would have earned $3,000 more without this restriction, but that's the low ability people are giving up much less to be on this program than the high ability people are. So if the high ability people could make $100,000 a year, but we would only allow them to make $5,000 a year, they're giving up $95,000 in earnings to qualify for this program. And so what they're saying is that for the low ability types, we make them a little worse off by restricting their income, or by, in these other examples we'll see, by doing things like making them wait in line, and in exchange for this first order targeting efficiency gain, right? So in terms of earned income, I think this is reasonable, right, that the low ability people have lower potential earnings than the high ability people. This is going to become more ambiguous whether this statement is true in the other examples. So let's just talk through like in-kind versus cash. Okay, so the argument so the question here is, why do we transfer a lot of resources as in-kind goods like public housing and food stamps instead of as cash? And I think the real, like the first order argument is paternalism, right? Like from in a political economy sense, like the reason we probably give people food stamps or public housing instead of cash is that we don't trust them to make good decisions with cash. And there's obviously this big movement to universal basic income, and you know, would people be better off making their own decisions, us giving them cash and them just being able to make their own decisions? Okay. But an argument that they use to justify this in-kind versus cash transfers are that maybe low ability people like the particular in-kind goods more than the high ability people like them. Okay. And in that situation, the high ability people aren't going to want to take up the program. So this, you know, like most obvious example maybe is public housing, right? That public housing we know has, in general, is very sort of inferior quality, lots of crime. And so a high ability person who can afford to live in better housing isn't going to take up housing assistance, right? And whereas the low ability people might value that housing assistance as much as they would value cash, the high ability people value cash a lot more. And so by transferring in-kind versus cash, you screen out the high ability people who do not value public housing, but you keep the low ability types who value public housing just as much as they value cash, or almost as much as they value cash. Okay. So again, this gets back to consumption smoothing versus moral hazard, right? That part of the idea behind providing public housing is that it's reducing moral hazard, right? We're only allowing people into the program who really need assistance, but by doing that, we're potentially reducing the consumption smoothing benefits of this program, right? They arguably, everybody, the low ability people and the high ability people would be weakly better off if we were to give them the same amount of cash assistance as we're giving them right now in public housing. And then the third example that they go through is ordeals. So this is application hassles, standing in line, filling out paperwork, right? The sort of administrative complexities of applying for a program. Why do we make people go through this? This seems very inefficient. We're wasting their time. And Nichols and Zeckhauser say yes, we are wasting their time. But again, the idea is that is a second order productive efficiency loss relative to the first order targeting efficiency gain that we're going to get. Okay. And the in-kind transfers versus cash and the ordeals are two places where I think the theory, right, they're going to write down a model in which we have a second order productive efficiency loss and a first order targeting efficiency gain. We could also write down a model that says exactly the opposite, right? That says for the low ability people, it's actually the case that these in-kind transfers or these ordeals are the most costly. And so we're not making them a little bit worse off, we're actually making them a lot worse off, right? And then we need to compare it to the gain in targeting efficiency, right? And so this, again, is a place where we need empirical evidence, right? So we can write down a model like Nichols and Zeckhauser do that say these things improve targeting efficiency, right? And I think this is what they present is a very useful way of thinking about these barriers to enrollment and program design rules. But we could also write down a model, a behavioral model or a neoclassical model that says exactly the opposite, right? That the people whom we most want on the program, these low ability people, it turns out that waiting in line or filling out paperwork is actually the most costly for them. Because the argument they're using is basically one about the opportunity cost of time, right? They're saying high ability people have a high opportunity cost of time. They're not going to want to wait in line and do other things. But if low ability people, even if they have a low opportunity cost of time, if waiting in line is difficult for them for other reasons, so the context that we're going to study here is the disability context. You could imagine that for people with a severe disability, going to the next office or waiting in line to get help, waiting in line for a long time to get help is very costly, and it's going to end up screening out the low ability people, right? So your point is well taken that this is the theory. I think it's a useful conceptual framework, and now we want to see what the answer is. Is it really true that the productive efficiency loss is small relative to the targeting efficiency gain, or is the productive efficiency loss actually much bigger than sort of this simple theory would predict?
Does the productive efficiency loss include like the government, like the administrative costs of creating hassles for people applying? Or I was thinking about the National School Lunch Program and how they recently, or like in the last 5 years, made it so that schools with sufficient numbers of low-income students could just provide free lunch for everyone. And I think there's probably a dual purpose there of reducing the administrative burden on schools to verify students' lunch status, as well as making sure that students.
But there's also, that's right. So it seems like the first order thing is it's more expensive for the government to provide free lunch to everyone, right? But then it's also, and then you have some reduction in administrative. So my guess would be, but I don't know, that the cost of providing lunch to everyone is more than the sort of savings of not having to determine people's eligibility. That's my guess. I could be wrong about that. But that's a good point. So Nichols and Zeckhauser in this paper are focusing on some beeping. I don't know what's happening. They're focusing on productive efficiency losses to the recipient, but absolutely in a cost-benefit analysis, we would want to consider also the cost to the government, right? So that's something that we'll do in this office closings paper. Is we'll also consider that there are administrative savings to the government from shutting down these offices. Yeah.
And these production inefficiencies get so large when you actually do more than 2 types. Because if you imagine that you have like continuum of types or like more than 2 types, then you have like types that are closer to the ones where you actually want to target your transfers to, and they are like more effective than like the very high ones. So your incentive constraints are like getting tighter, right? So I'm just asking myself if these are generalized if you just move away from the assumption that you don't just have 2 types.
2 types.
Because in reality we don't have 2 types.
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody has tried this model with a continuum of types. I'd imagine it matters because they're moving on 2 dimensions, right? They're moving on their opportunity cost of time, right? And then they're moving on their ability. So I guess yeah, let me think about that. So I guess it depends on whether you assume opportunity costs of time are linear in type, right? So like in ability, or if they look concave or convex, I imagine then you could get different results.
So I was also thinking about the same problem. I was wondering about if we included risk aversion on the part of the actors, then you could easily imagine that the types above the threshold that we would like to target would still sign up for this program, just as a means of, insuring themselves because we don't know if there's going to be a recession tomorrow. People that are marginal types lose their job, so you might have to just have a permanent income instead of having to deal with the job market.
Yeah.
You're slightly above maybe marginal.
Right. That's a good point. So we want to think about not just potential earnings, but we want to think about utility, which is going to incorporate risk aversion. Right. Yeah. That's a good point. And I think, in fact, they do their model if I remember correctly, they do their model in terms of utility, but I think they're just assuming a one-to-one relationship between utility and potential earnings. Okay, great. So another way to think about the argument that Nichols and Zeckhauser are making is that you have lower consumption smoothing benefits for the high ability types in order to reduce moral hazard among the high ability types, right? So you make the program less attractive to high ability types. You give them public housing instead of cash. You make them wait in line. You restrict their earnings. And that's going to lower the consumption smoothing benefits of these programs for high ability types in order to reduce moral hazard. But what you're also going to end up doing in the process is reducing consumption smoothing benefits for the low ability types. And that's kind of exactly what we want to think about, right? Is for the low ability types, is it actually true that you are making them only a little bit worse off, and in exchange able to give them a more generous benefit? Or is it the case that you're actually making them substantially worse off by making them jump through these hoops or restricting their earnings? Okay. So the paradox of screening is, by imposing a cost on the low ability types, we could, in principle, make them better off, right? So we impose this second order cost on low ability types, and we make them better off because that cost allows us to target better, which allows us to increase the generosity of the program. Okay, so that's, I think I'm just going to skip this. That is sort of Nichols and Zeckhauser theory. Now, what we've already been talking about is another argument. So Bertrand, Mullinathon, and Shafir are coming at this problem from a behavioral standpoint, that these seemingly small hassles, like waiting in line, like filling out paperwork, might actually deter low ability people the most, right? So, and you might imagine it matters a lot what kind of cost we're imposing. If it's a pure opportunity cost of time, we might expect it to deter high ability people the most. But if we're also imposing a cognitive cost, filling out complicated paperwork, or a physical cost, literally having to stand in line, for somebody with a disability, that we could get different effects, right? Now that now these ordeals are not imposing the biggest relative costs on high ability, but might actually be imposing the biggest relative costs on the low ability people, the people that we want on these programs. So we have sort of the straw man set up between Nichols and Zeckhauser on the one hand that are saying ordeals might improve targeting by screening out high ability people, and Bertrand, Mullinathon, and Shafir, who are saying ordeals could worsen targeting by screening out low ability people. Okay. I think it's important to say that you don't need a behavioral model to make the opposite argument. We could write down a neoclassical model that finds the opposite effects of Nichols and Zeckhauser by just saying that instead of just considering opportunity cost of time, we're also going to consider other types of costs, and those costs are, have a different relationship to ability than the opportunity cost of time. Okay, so the empirical question is, who is right? Right, economics throwdown. So we've talked about it probably depends on the type of ordeal, time cost versus cognitive costs. Evidence on this question in the US has mostly focused on take-up rather than targeting. I think a lot of that is, as with our previous discussion, is about data, that observing enrollment is easier than observing detailed characteristics about applicants or recipients. Okay? So in terms of the effect of ordeals on take-up, so Meyer, Rose, and Slater has evidence on the effects of opening a WIC office, and she finds that opening a WIC office in a neighborhood increases enrollment in WIC in that neighborhood by 6%. There are the two famous papers, one on FAFSA assistance. So they randomize people who are going into an H&R block to get assistance with filling out the FAFSA versus, I think they have a control group that's no assistance, and then they have one group that's information only, and then their main treatment is somebody sitting down and helping you actually fill out the FAFSA. And they find huge effects on FAFSA submission, on college enrollment, and on college completion as a result of FAFSA assistance. Madrian and Shia is the famous auto 401k enrollment, where they find dramatic increases in 401k participation as a result of essentially lowering barriers to enrollment by making it an opt-out system instead of an opt-in system. And then in terms of public benefits, we have Kopchak and I never know how to say his last name. Poe. Anybody? Okay. Kiki. That's what he goes by, so we're going to call him Kiki. The introduction of e-filing increases EITC claiming by 12%. And then Ebenstein and Stange find no effect of internet-based UI claiming on take-up of UI. Okay. So we have a lot less evidence on how ordeals affect the targeting of these programs, right? So the evidence that we just talked about, that's all about take-up. But we also want to know who is taking up, right? Are the people who are discouraged from enrolling as a result of ordeals, are they the people that we really want on the program, or are they people that we actually don't want on the program, and these ordeals are serving a productive purpose of screening them out? So there is a paper, a paper in the Journal of Political Economy from last year, Alatas et al., in a very nice paper using a randomized control trial in Indonesia, where they're working on this Indonesian welfare program where the default is, the status quo is automatic enrollment in this program based on administrative data and some survey collection that the government does. Okay. And what they do in this experiment is they randomize some villages to have to go physically to an office and enroll in this program rather than automatically being enrolled. Okay, so you're increasing you're increasing travel costs, right? You have to travel somewhere, and then you also have to wait at the office for some number of hours. So they approximate that they're increasing the cost of enrolling in this program by half a day. You have to spend half a day going to the office and sitting there to enroll. Okay. And what they find is that this increasing barriers to enrollment in this context improves targeting by discouraging higher income households from applying. So what happens is that the higher income households just assume that they're not eligible for this program. And so before they were being automatically enrolled under the status quo system, but once they have to go to an office, they just assume that they're not eligible, and so they don't go to the office. That's the explanation that they give. Okay. And so this is improving targeting. In my paper with Yue Li, we look at the effect of increasing application costs in the context of the US disability insurance program. So we're using the closings of Social Security field offices, places where people go to get help with their disability application. And we find that these increases in application costs are going to worsen targeting. They're going to discourage low SES applicants and applicants with fairly severe medical conditions the most. So that is what I want to spend. How long do we go till? Till 5. So I have 15 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Okay, I won't go over too much. Thanks. That is useful to know. Okay. Okay, so the motivation for this program is rapid enrollment, rapid growth in disability programs across the developed world. So more than 6% of the US adult population receives disability benefits. And we have this question of how we target disability benefits, right? So we use a tag, obviously. We have a disability determination process where someone decides whether you meet the requirements. But then we also have a self-screening process. So before you even get to the disability determination stage, these application costs might might screen people into or out of applying for disability. So you have to provide medical documentation, you have to fill out forms, right? You have to go through a pretty complicated process to enroll in disability. And the point that I alluded to before, and I think is important to reiterate, is that compared to income-based programs, the application process is particularly important in the disability context. So with programs that are based only on income and earnings, right, the government collects administrative data on your income and your earnings, and they can see if you are eligible for a program or likely to be eligible for a program. So for food stamps, they know if you're eligible, or they can do a pretty good job of predicting whether you're eligible, and they can send you a notice that says, hey, you're not enrolled in food stamps, but we think you might be eligible. That is not the case with disability, right? So we do not collect administrative data on disability or health status in the population. And so if we have an application process that is so complicated that high severity people don't apply for the program, there's really no other way to find those people and target benefits to them, right? So we really want to design an application process such that the people we want applying, the highly disabled people, are willing to go through all of the administrative burden of applying for disability. And conversely, we know that people who are ultimately rejected from disability, whose conditions are not severe enough to get disability, applying for them is bad ex post, because they experience these deterioration of human capital. So this Otter et al. Paper finds that waiting longer in the application process means lower earnings once you're rejected from disability. Okay, so we want to, if they don't internalize these costs, that's an important caveat, we want to deter them from applying in the first place if we know that they're not going to get on the program. Okay, so for these reasons, designing the application process in a thoughtful way, I think, is more important in this context than it is in programs that are just based on earnings and income. Okay, so we're going to study in this question how application costs affect the targeting of disability programs. And again, we set up this, this conflict between these two hypotheses in the literature. And we're also going to study which types of application costs have the largest discouragement effect. So we're going to be able to distinguish travel costs from information costs and from just wait times, waiting costs. And the way we're going to do this is using variation in application costs induced by the closings of Social Security field offices. These offices provide information and assistance to disability applicants. We're going to use a diff and diff, exploiting variation in the timing of the closing. So basically what we're doing is we're using offices that experience a closing in the future as controls for offices that experience a closing today. Okay, so we have a lot of data from the Social Security Administration on the field offices themselves and on applicants, including a lot of detailed characteristics about applicants, like their pre-application earnings, their severity, the type of disability they have, their education for the adults, and then we see where they live at the zip code level, so that's going to be important for the geographic component, and then we have some publicly available zip code data. Okay. I don't want to spend a lot of time on background other than to say that the way this application process works is that you don't have to go into an office to apply. You can apply on the phone or you can apply online. So there's nothing that requires you to go to an office to apply for disability. Okay, the office is there to provide information and assistance. Once you apply, your local field office will process the application based on where you live, and then the application goes to a state office. So just to show you visually, the field office, these are the offices that we're going to talk about today that are closing. These are offices that provide assistance, and they also process your application once you apply. Your application then goes to a state office where a disability examiner makes a decision about your case. And then if you're rejected, you can then appeal to higher levels. Okay, so what's really important to understand here is that these field offices, the ones that are closing, are not the ones that are making decisions about your application, right? They're only providing information and assistance about the program. Okay, so there have been about 125 office closings since 2000 out of about 1,200 offices. The field offices do a lot of things, but disability applications take up a disproportionate amount of staff time. They're complicated. You have to fill out a lot of information about your work history, about your medical condition, about your treatment, about medications. It's relevant to consider why these offices are closing. This is mostly federal budget cuts. So You can see this is a sort of timing of office closings. This is all sequestration right here. So federal budget cuts have led to a lot of office closings. What we're going to find, just to preempt your very good question about whether these closings are random, is that the closings themselves are not random, but the timing of the closings are random. And so that's why we're using this empirical strategy of using the future closings as a control for current closings. Okay, so this is just a map of field offices. So the blue stars here are open offices, and the red diamonds here are closed offices. And we're going to categorize zip codes based on their proximity to a closed office. So if your closest office is closed, we're going to call you a closing zip code. If your closest office is a neighbor of an office that has closed, we're going to call you a neighboring zip code. And the reason that we care about these neighboring zip codes is that what we're going to find is that when one office closes, the neighboring offices are going to become more congested. And that's going to lead to a reduction in disability applications in the neighboring zip codes in addition to the closing zip codes through this congestion channel.
Can we go back to your figure, please?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if there is any particular reason why the middle part of the country seems to be more affected with this, in the sense that there are more closings on the middle.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a regression where we see what observable characteristics predict office closings, and like proximity to the next office is a predictor. But I couldn't tell you why like Social Security won't give away the secret sauce of how they're determining the office closings. And so in some sense, we have to rely on empirically looking at pre-trends. But
people are living in this area, so I just wonder.
So yeah, it would be useful to know how those correspond with cities. So if we superimpose cities on here, that would be useful to know, because there are some people who live in the Midwest, but they're like.
I used to like to think of the Midwest on the Great Lakes, but
Yeah.
over here like mountain. I'm not from the U.S. I don't know the geography of.
I'm from the U.S. and I'm terrible at geography, so I couldn't tell you. Yeah, I couldn't tell you to what extent these closings correspond with cities, but I imagine that they're. I'm gonna.
So you said timing is random?
So the timing is random is what we find. At least we find that the timing is not predicted by observable characteristics of an office or a region. But the closing itself is non-random. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
So that's why we don't want to just compare places that close to places that don't close, right? We want to do this, compare the future closing to the current closing.
So is there any unobservables, like the quality of people that work in an office?
Are there field office characteristics that predict whether the office is closed? Unobservables?
Yeah.
There must be something unobservable, selection on some unobservables, right? Because we're finding, sorry.
About the timing.
The timing, right. So to test that, we're gonna have to rely on looking at pre-trends. Yeah, that's the only way we'll test unobservables. Yeah.
Can you rule out a story of local deployment of counseling or other kind of like a nonprofit stepping in to try to say, well, you don't have field offices nearby, can we help you prepare your disability application the same way we have like tax assistance that tends not to come as much from IRA as it does from either volunteers or an actual nonprofit?
Yeah, so this is a good point, and there's a broader point that there are a lot of reasons we wouldn't expect these closings to have a big effect. One of them is that these nonprofits might be stepping in. Another is that the application is available online, right? It's also, you can do it by phone. There's no reason that you have to go to a field office to submit an application. And yet, in spite of that, we're going to find very large effects on take-up and on targeting. And that suggests that maybe there are these nonprofits that are coming in, but the effect would have been even larger if in the absence of those nonprofits.
To submit an application, does it require, to submit an application online, do you need to scan documents? Or I was trying to think about costs to applying online?
So usually they're mailing documents back online. You have to mail a document in.
Got it.
Even when you go to a field office, there's often mailing that happens after you meet with somebody. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm gonna press on here. Okay. So the raw application trends. So here, this is just raw application data. I'm not doing any regressions. So this is the treatment group, the offices that closed, and this is the control group, the offices that will close in the future. You can see that the controls are on this upward secular trend, whereas you can see that the treatment group is experiencing this decline in applications in the quarter of the closing. We can put this in a diff and diff regression framework. So this is just a standard diff and diff regression. We're going to have zip fixed effects, state by year fixed effects. And then our coefficients of interest are going to be these delta taus. They're going to give us the difference in either take-up or targeting between treatment and control tau quarters before or after the closing. Okay. So in all of the graphs that I'll show you, I'm going to be plotting these delta taus over time. Okay. We're going to cluster our standard errors at the level of the variation, which is the closing level. So remember, we had 125 closings. And then we're going to weight zip codes by the number of pre-closing applications. Okay, so the first thing that we find, the first result is that disability applications fall by 11% in closing zip codes. So a few things to point out. The first is that, this test of unobservable characteristics, right, the best we can do is is look at these pre-trends, and we find that there's no trend between control and treatment areas before the closing. The second thing is, you'll notice that it takes some time for the number of applications to fall. This is probably because it just takes time to submit an application. And so you're going to have some people who got help with their application just before the office closed who are still going to submit the application, right? And then eventually, nobody who wants to submit an application is getting help from that particular field office. Okay. The other thing to notice is that these effects are persistent. So even 2 years after the closing, disability applications show no sign of recovering. So we might think that, the office closes, people didn't expect it, they find some way to adjust, it takes a little bit of time. But what we see here is that even 2 years after the closing, there's no recovery in disability applications. Okay. Now, it could be the case that, we see a reduction in applications, but from a welfare standpoint, we want to look at what is the reduction in disability recipients, right? Because it could be that all of the people here who are discouraged from applying are people that we would have rejected from the disability program anyways. And so this could actually be a productive ordeal, like Nichols and Zeckhauser argue, right? That the people we're discouraging are people who are low severity who would not get on disability. And so it's good for them because they don't waste their time applying. It's good for the government. We save money on disability examiners having to review their applications. And so the next thing we want to look at is what is the effect on the number of recipients. And we find, in contrast to that hypothesis, that the number of recipients is also falling substantially. It's falling by 13% in closing zip codes. And again, the effects of the closings are persistent. Okay. So the next thing I want to look at, so the title of this paper is Who is Screened Out? Right? So in addition to the number of people who are screened out, we want to look at which types of people are screened out. So we have a number of measures of, starting with health, we have a measure of severity. So I would normally spend some time going through how we define severity, and I'd be happy to talk about it later, but just in the interest of time, we're going to classify people into low severity, medium severity, high severity, and very high severity. And then we're going to distinguish disability types, mental, musculoskeletal, and other physical. We also see some measures of socioeconomic status, their pre-application earnings, and their education level. And then we see their age. Okay, so with respect to severity, I like to say that this graph is sort of a Rorschach test for what you think about ordeals. Because you could look at this graph and say, well, these very high severity people, the ones in the darkest brown line, when the office closes, they don't reduce their applications very much, right? And so this is a great ordeal, right? We've imposed this ordeal, but the very high severity people are continuing to apply. You could also look at this graph and say this ordeal is terrible because the low severity people, the lightest line here, they also continue to apply for the most part. Okay. Where we see the biggest reductions are in these middle categories, the medium medium severity and high severity categories have the biggest reduction in disability applications. Okay. Now remember, so actually don't remember because I didn't tell you, but rather the low severity are the people who will be denied from the program, whereas the medium, high severity, and very high severity are all categories that would have been allowed onto the program had they applied. Okay. So you can see that if we did this just based on would you have been allowed or not, we would see a larger effect on people who would have been allowed for the program, which actually we just saw when we compared applications versus recipients, right? That there's a larger reduction in recipients than applicants, and that means that it's disproportionately affecting people who would have been allowed onto the program had they applied. With respect to disability type, the differences are less stark. It looks like musculoskeletal, the point estimates are smaller, but if I remember correctly, these are not statistically distinguishable. And then with respect to SES, what we find is that the low SES that the effects are largest for low SES applicants. So high school dropouts, the effect is a 13% reduction versus college graduates, just a 4% reduction. And it's a similar story for if we look at pre-application earnings. So those with the lowest pre-application earnings have the largest discouragement effect. For the people with the highest pre-application earnings, what seems to be happening actually is we're finding evidence of anticipatory behavior, that these high SES applicants, they anticipate the closing, maybe they're more informed, they anticipate the office closing, and they rush to submit their disability application before the office closes. And then it's possible that any reduction here is just intertemporal substitution, right? Applications that they would have submitted here, they're instead submitting here before the office closes. Okay. Age I will skip. So what we've learned so far is that there's a large decline in applications, a large decline in the number of recipients, and the closings are disproportionately affecting low SES applicants and applicants with fairly severe medical conditions. Okay, so in that sense, they seem to be worsening targeting. Interpreting effects on take-up. So when we compare the estimated disability benefits that these people are giving up to the additional time cost that they have to spend on their application now that the office is closed, we find an implied value of time of around $100 an hour, including for SSI recipients or SSI applicants who are by definition low income and low asset. Okay. This is actually consistent with the Alatas et al. Indonesia paper, where their back of the envelope calculations suggest about $20 an hour of implied value of time. And if you compare US and Indonesian wages, right, if anything, that estimate is bigger. So these are large effects, right? And so the question is why? Why are the effects on take-up so large? That's a question that we can't answer directly in this paper, but I think there's a lot of work to be done here. So one possibility is credit constraints, that when an office closes, you would like to pay somebody to help you fill out your application, but you can't because of credit constraints. An obvious solution or workaround to that would be, well, you just promise your disability benefits, some portion of your disability benefits to the person who's helping you. It turns out there are actually legal restrictions on that. So the government restricts, we can argue about advantages and disadvantages of doing that, but the government restricts compensation to third-party representatives of disability applicants. So you can't just say, I'm going to give you 25% of my benefits if you help me. That is not allowed. Present bias is maybe the most obvious explanation, that people are myopic. They're overweighting the cost of applying today relative to this large stream of future benefits. And this is a lot of money, right? So especially relative to the potential earnings of this population. We should be surprised, right? That's why the implied value of time is so high, because these expected benefits are, the net present value of these expected benefits is very large. Another possibility is that applicants are updating about the likelihood that they'll get on the program, or even about the likelihood that the program exists, right? So this would be a very nice place to do qualitative work to understand, like when an office closes, what do people think about the Social Security program? Do they realize that it's just this one office closing? Or do they think that there's no more Social Security? Or do they think that, well, there's so few resources that I'm never going to get on, or it'll be 10 years before I get on, right? That would be very useful to know, to be able to interpret these results and understand why these magnitudes are so big. In terms of targeting, so we use a targeting efficiency conceptual framework that I did not present to you just because we didn't have enough time. But when we use this sort of model of targeting and we put in our numbers, we find a decline in targeting using the current standards of the Social Security Administration. So this is an important distinction, right? We can measure how targeting efficiency changes with respect to current standards for disability benefits, also realizing that not everybody agrees with the current standards for disability benefits. And that's exactly why we also do this heterogeneity based on observable dimensions, right? So if you think that it's only the very high severity people who should be getting on this program, from your perspective, there has been an improvement in targeting efficiency, right? Because we see that the very high severity continue applying, and other people, the other groups are more discouraged. Okay, so that's an important point, that we're going to use the current government standards, but we're also going to let you use your own preferences by giving you these heterogeneity based on these observable dimensions. I'm not going to go through this model. So what we basically, we develop a model, an admittedly ex post model, to rationalize these non-monotonic effects in severity. And the upshot is, I won't go through the math, but the upshot is basically that what we find empirically is that these low severity individuals look like high need individuals when we look at earnings and income. So they've very recently had some kind of income or earnings shock. They're more likely to have had a recent income or earnings shock. And so we can think of the low severity people as more likely to be sort of economically driven applicants, right? And so their opportunity cost of time, even though they're healthy, might be low because they have few earnings opportunities, and so they continue applying. And the very high severity people continue applying because their expected benefits are very high. The likelihood that they get on is very high, and their opportunity cost of time is low because their disabilities are so severe that they couldn't be working anyway.
How what is your explanation for the difference to Indonesia results? Is it that the shock is very different, the type of shock they get?
Yeah, so there are a few different things, right? So one is, first it's just they're very different settings in general, but two specific things are, first, that in the Indonesia context, they're going from zero application costs to a small application cost. We are going from a high application cost to an even higher application cost. And so if effects of application costs are nonlinear, right, you could get different results depending on where in the application cost function you are. That's one point. The other point is that, but actually works in the opposite direction of what we find, but another major difference is that I think in our context, more than theirs, you would expect these closings not to matter because you have the access to the online application, because you can do this by phone, because the quality of our infrastructure is better. Right, so in the Indonesia context, the only way to get onto this program is to physically go to the office and sit there and enroll in benefits. In our context, you can go online, you can call, right? But that works in the other direction of what we find, or the difference that we find.
If the effect is nonlinear, that's quite important as well, right, to know.
Yes, so the first explanation could still be true, right? That the going from zero to positive is different than going from high to very high, right? So that could still explain the differences. Yeah, good question. But there's a lot more work to be done on both why take-up is so, why the effects on take-up are so big in both contexts, and on the targeting question, right? So we now have 2 empirical papers on this topic. There's room for a lot more empirical work in this area. So I'd love to talk about channels, but I'm sort of out of time. And so just what I'll say is that we look at congestion, different channels, congestion at neighboring field offices, travel time to neighboring field offices, and program information and network effects. And what we find when we sort of put this in an IV framework is that the thing that appears to matter the most is congestion at neighboring offices. Okay, so more than travel time, congestion seems to matter. The most likely explanation for that is that most people are interacting with the field office by phone rather than in person. So travel costs are only going to affect you if you go in person, but these congestion costs, these wait times are going to affect you whether you show up in person or if you call, right?
Sorry, what's the reason that people need assistance at all? Why can't they fill out the forms on their own? Do you have any idea?
They're complicated forms. So an interesting thing is, I've gone to a number of field offices now just for site visits, and they often have kiosks, like self-service kiosks. It's just a computer, and you can fill out the application online. And the idea is, if you have questions, you can get help. Nobody uses those kiosks, right? They're like, if I came to an office, I'm going to get help in person, and I don't want to mess this up. This is like a big deal, and I want someone to help me with the application. It's a complicated application, right? And if most of the sort of demographic of this program is less than high school education or high school education.
Wouldn't the solution maybe be in changing that, how complex it is?
The outcome, sorry.
So you stand in line, but just easy. When it's easy to stand in line, you still have the cost, but everyone can do it. Does it make sense?
So you're saying change this all to a time cost?
Yeah.
Instead of an application cost. Yeah, I mean, I think one important point, right, is that this is not just an ordeal in the sense that the information that's being provided is useful in the disability determination process, right? It's not like they're having you play tic-tac-toe for 5 hours. Right? That's not the application. That's like it actually provides valuable information. So yeah, you would have to weigh that against the cost of then how do you collect this information if not by requiring applicants to provide it. You could think about, are there more things that we could do by going directly to medical providers or something like that, right? It's a little bit hard to think of in the sort of data that we have available right now how we would do that. But that's something, I mean, it's a good point that you're making, but also that the information that they're providing is productive. And so we'd have to think about the cost of getting rid of that. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here. The last question sort of that I was getting to was about spillover effects. It's literally 2 slides. And the point that I'm making on the spillover effects is that first, there isn't very much work on spillover effects, right? So that's why the three things that I cite, 2 of them are news articles, and 1 of them is a real paper. So this Finkelstein 2007 paper on the introduction of Medicare, what she finds is that if you compare the effect of the introduction of Medicare on healthcare utilization to estimates from the Rand health insurance experiment, just giving one person health insurance, the effects on healthcare utilization in the context of the introduction of Medicare are much larger, so something like 6 times larger. And the reason she speculates is that when you have such a dramatic change in health insurance coverage, there are spillover effects. There are now, pharmaceutical companies are now developing drugs for conditions that affect elderly people. Hospitals are investing in technology like MRI machines, right? And all of these investments and changes are going to have spillovers onto the non-elderly population. And so we have a little bit of evidence on spillovers in the health insurance context, very little with respect to any other program. So, this disability insurance anecdote is like they go to this county in Alabama where a lot of people are on disability insurance, and they document how the entire economy is driven by disability. Like when the disability checks come in, the town is very active, groceries shelves are stocked, people are out, and then by the end of the month when the money runs out, it's kind of a ghost town. And the same thing for food stamps. So you can imagine that for a lot of these programs are having effects on non-recipients just because, it could be social norms, like my friends are all on disability, and so even if I'm not on disability, I'm going to decide to retire early or, decide to work less so that there's complementarities in leisure. It could be through local labor markets, that there are enough people out of the labor market because of these programs that wages for people who do work who are not on these programs are higher, right? And so this is an area where we need a lot more research. So I encourage you to think about that. All right. Thanks for your attention, and sorry to go late.